Hello everyone and welcome back to the Unexplained Diaries. Here on this channel I share real-life encounters with beings from beyond the skies to help you unwind and drift off to sleep. Before we dive in, I would love to hear from you. Leave a comment and let me know where you're tuning in from. Now, find a comfortable spot, relax, and let's begin. I noticed it because the motion alert didn't make sense. It came through at 2:13 a.m., which already stood out because nothing ever triggered that late. I live on a quiet cul-de-sac, no foot traffic, no cars cutting through. The only things that usually set it off are cats or the occasional fox. I didn't check it right away. I was asleep. It was the next morning when I saw the notification sitting there on my phone. Just a generic alert from the front camera. No thumbnail preview, that was the first odd thing. Usually it shows a still frame. This one didn't. I tapped it. The app opened and buffered for a second longer than usual. Then the clip loaded. At first everything looked normal. The front garden, driveway, fence, street beyond, early morning darkness, slightly grainy. I watched it once, nothing happened, no movement, no person, no animal. I frowned and checked the timeline. The clip was shorter than usual, only about 6 seconds. Normally it records closer to 15. I scrubbed back to the start and played it again. This time, I noticed it. A distortion. Faint, moving across the frame, not a shape, not an object, just a ripple, like heat haze. But it was cold that night, near freezing. You could see the frost on the ground in the corners of the image. The distortion moved slowly from left to right, bending the image slightly as it passed. The fence line warped, the edges of the driveway shimmered. Then it reached the middle of the frame, and the video skipped. Not a glitchy stutter, a clean jump, one frame to the next. I paused it, checked the timestamp. There was a gap, 3 seconds missing. I rewound it again, watched carefully. The distortion entered from the left, moved steadily. Then, skip. It was suddenly further across, near the right side of the frame. Then it continued, fading as it went, until the image returned to normal. I sat there for a second, staring at the screen. Then I opened the back garden camera. Scrolled to the same time, same thing. A distortion, moving across, different angle, but the same effect. The timestamp skipped there too. Not exactly the same amount, but close. I replayed both clips side by side. The distortions lined up, roughly the same movement, same direction, same speed. I zoomed in on the front camera footage. The distortion didn't have edges. It didn't block anything. It just bent the image, like something invisible passing through. I tried to enhance the brightness. It didn't help. If anything, it made it harder to see. The distortion blended into the noise. I leaned back in my chair, trying to think of what it could be. Heat shimmer didn't make sense. There was no heat source, no exhaust, no fire, and it was the middle of the night, cold. Still. I checked the weather from that night. Clear. No wind. No temperature shifts. Nothing unusual. I went back to the footage again. Paused it right before the skip. Stared at the frame. The distortion was mid-frame. Subtle, but there. I stepped through frame by frame, watching how it moved. It didn't ripple like heat. It didn't flicker. It moved as one continuous thing. Then I hit the skip again, and something stood out. The position didn't match. It had jumped forward more than it should have in that time. I checked the timestamps again. 3 seconds missing. But the distortion had moved further than 3 seconds worth of motion. I replayed it, again, and again. Same result every time. I stood up and went to the window. Looked out at the front garden. Everything looked normal. Fence, drive, nothing out of place. I stepped outside. The air was cold, still. I walked slowly across the same path the distortion had taken. From left to right, nothing happened. No change in the air, no sound. I stopped in the middle of the drive, looked toward the camera, then back toward the fence, trying to imagine what could have caused it. Nothing made sense. I went back inside, checked the footage again. This time I noticed something else. Right before the distortion entered the frame, the image shifted slightly. Not a full movement, just a tiny adjustment like the camera had recalibrated. Then the distortion appeared. I checked the back camera again. Same thing, a slight shift. Then the distortion. Then the skip. Then normal. I checked older footage, scrolled back through the previous nights. Nothing like it. Everything was stable, consistent. I sat there for a while longer, watching the clip loop, the distortion moving across, the time skipping. Then I noticed something else. In one of the frames, just before the skip, there was a faint shadow, Not cast on anything, just present. A darker patch within the distortion. I paused it, zoomed in, it broke apart into pixels, no clear shape, no detail, but it was there. I leaned closer to the screen, trying to hold on to it. The more I looked, the harder it was to see, like it didn't want to stay in focus. I sat back again. Then I looked at the timestamp, 2:13 a.m. I checked my phone's activity. I'd been asleep. No movement, no notifications, nothing. I checked the system logs for the cameras. They'd stayed online the whole time. No disconnects, no errors, just that one event. I watched the clip one last time. The distortion moved across the yard. The image bent. The timestamp jumped. Then everything returned to normal. But the thing that stayed with me was how the distortion didn't interact with anything. It didn't disturb the frost, didn't cast a shadow, didn't reflect light. It just passed through like whatever it was wasn't entirely in the same place as everything else. I noticed it because I woke up already tense. Not startled, not like from a noise or a dream, just awake, all at once, like something had switched me on. My eyes opened and I didn't move straight away. I just lay there, staring into the dark. The room looked normal, same shapes, same shadows, curtains drawn, no light from outside, but there was this feeling, like someone had just been there, right at the foot of the bed. Close enough that I should have heard them breathing or shifting their weight. I stayed still, listening. Nothing. No footsteps, no movement. Just that quiet you get late at night when everything's settled. I told myself it was nothing. Just one of those things where you wake up and your brain fills in something that isn't there. I started to relax. Then I noticed the air. It felt different. Not across the whole room, just there, at the end of the bed. I lifted my head slightly. The duvet shifted softly. The sound felt duller than it should have. I pushed myself up onto my elbows, stared toward the foot of the bed. Nothing, just darkness. But the air looked wrong, not visibly moving, just thicker. I swung one leg out from under the duvet and let my foot hover over the edge of the mattress. Then I lowered it slowly. The floor felt cold, normal. I stood up, carefully, trying not to make noise. The room stayed quiet. I took a step forward, toward where that feeling was. The air changed. It was subtle, but noticeable. Warmer, not by much, just enough to register. I stopped, stood there, right at the foot of the bed. The warmth was localized. A small area, no source, no reason. I reached out slowly with my hand, held it in that space. The skin on my fingers picked it up immediately, warmer than the rest of the room. Not hot, not even uncomfortable. Just wrong, like the air there didn't match everything else. I moved my hand through it. The warmth didn't shift, didn't disperse, it stayed in place, like it was fixed. I pulled my hand back, looked around the room again. Nothing had changed. Everything still, everything quiet. I checked the window, still closed, no gaps, no breeze. I turned slightly, looking at the walls, nothing. Then I stepped back. The warmth faded as I moved away. I stepped forward again. It returned, same spot, same size. I felt that quiet tension settle in. Not fear, just something not lining up. I glanced at my phone on the bedside table. The screen was off. I picked it up, turned it on. The light filled the room. I looked at the foot of the bed. Nothing. The warmth wasn't noticeable anymore. I stepped forward again, held my hand out, normal, just regular air. I frowned and turned the phone off. The room dropped back into darkness. I waited, then stepped forward again. The warmth returned, exactly where it had been. I froze, holding my hand in that space, trying to understand it. Then I noticed something else, the sound, or lack of it. The room felt quieter near that spot, not silent, just less. Like the air there wasn't carrying sound properly. I shifted my weight slightly. The floor creaked, but the sound felt muted when I stood closer to that area. I stepped back, the normal sound returned. I stepped forward, muted again. I swallowed, felt a slight pressure in my ears, subtle, like a change in altitude. I looked down at the floor. Nothing. No marks, no shadows, just the carpet. I looked back up. The space was still there. Warm, quiet, unchanged. I checked my phone again. The time didn't make sense. I was sure I'd only been awake for a minute or two. The phone said nearly 20 minutes had passed. I stared at it, trying to process that. Then I looked back at the foot of the bed. The warmth had started to fade, slowly. Not spreading, not moving, just losing intensity. I stepped forward again, held my hand out. It was still there, but weaker. I waited. The warmth continued to diminish, gradually, until it was gone. The air returned to normal. The sound came back fully. The pressure in my ears eased. I stood there for a moment, waiting. Nothing returned. I got back into bed slowly, pulled the duvet up, lay on my back again, staring at the ceiling. The room felt normal, everything in place, everything quiet, but the space at the foot of the bed, the way it had felt occupied, like something had just stepped away, stayed with me. Because there had been nothing to see, just the air, holding on to something that wasn't there anymore. I noticed it because my alarm didn't go off. That's what woke me up, just the absence of it. I usually set 2 5-minutes apart because I'm terrible at mornings. That day, nothing. I opened my eyes slowly, still half asleep, and reached out for my phone on the bedside table. It wasn't there. I blinked, thinking I'd knocked it off in my sleep. I leaned over the edge of the bed and looked down. Nothing on the floor. I pushed myself up slightly, scanning around the room. That's when I saw it. My phone was across the room, on the desk, face down. I stared at it for a few seconds, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't used it last night after getting into bed. I remembered setting the alarm, plugging it in, and putting it right next to me. That's it. I sat up fully, still staring at it. The room felt quiet. Too quiet. Not silent. Just muted. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood up. The floor felt colder than it should have. I walked slowly toward the desk. The phone hadn't moved, just sitting there. I picked it up and turned it over. The screen lit up. 3%. That didn't make sense either. It had been charging. I remembered plugging it in. I looked at the cable, still on the bedside table, unplugged from the phone. I frowned and checked the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd gone to bed around midnight. The phone said 4:38. Too early. Too much time missing. I tried to think back, getting into bed, setting the alarm, lying there for a bit. Then nothing. No memory of getting up, no memory of moving the phone. I stood there for a moment, holding it. Then I looked around the room. Everything else looked normal. The chair, the wardrobe, nothing out of place, but something felt off, like the air hadn't settled properly. I walked back to the bed and looked at the sheets. They were disturbed, but not in a way that made sense. Not like I just rolled over. More like I'd gotten up and then gotten back in, except I didn't remember doing that. I sat down on the edge of the bed, checked my phone again, no notifications, no missed calls, just the alarm still set, untouched. I rubbed my face, trying to wake myself up properly. Then I noticed something else. My legs felt slightly sore, not pain, just tension, like I'd been walking. I stood up again, took a few steps. The feeling was still there, subtle but noticeable. I looked back at the desk, at the phone, trying to piece it together. Then I checked the battery usage. The screen had been on during the night, for longer than it should have been. I scrolled through it. There was a gap, a stretch of time where the phone had been active, but there were no apps open, no records of anything, just usage. I frowned, trying to understand it. Then I opened the camera. The last photo wasn't from yesterday. It was from the night, time-stamped at 2:17. I tapped on it. The image was dark, almost completely black, but there was something in it, a faint blur near the edge of the frame. I zoomed in. It broke apart into noise. No detail, no shape I could recognize. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then I looked around the room again, trying to match the angle. The photo seemed to be taken from near the door, facing toward the bed, but I didn't remember standing there. I didn't remember taking it. I checked the rest of the gallery, nothing else from that time, just that one image. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not lining up. I checked the time again, 4:44. I was sure it had just been 4:38. I blinked, looked again, still 4:44. I stood there holding the phone, listening. The house was quiet, no movement, no sound. I walked over to the door and opened it slightly. The hallway was dark, empty. I stepped out. The air felt normal. The quiet sounded right. I stood there for a moment, then went back into the room, closed the door, locked it. I sat back down on the bed, looked at the phone again, 3%. I plugged it in this time, set it back on the bedside table. Then I lay down again, staring at the ceiling, trying to remember anything. But there was nothing, just that gap, that missing stretch of time, and the feeling that whatever had moved the phone had done it while I was awake. I noticed it because it moved wrong right away. I'd been out in the back garden for maybe 20 minutes already, just lying on one of those cheap folding loungers I keep out there. It was one of those clear nights where you can actually see a decent amount of stars, not just the usual handful. No wind, no noise from the road, just that still, quiet air. I wasn't really looking for anything specific, just letting my eyes adjust, picking out patterns, watching for satellites maybe. That's when I saw it. A bright point of light, higher up than most of the stars around it. At first I thought it was just another star I hadn't noticed. Then it dropped, straight down, fast. Not like a shooting star. There was no streak, no trail, just a clean vertical movement, like someone had pulled it down on a string. I sat up, slightly, my eyes locked on it. It stopped, mid-sky, completely still, like it had hit something invisible. I held my breath without meaning to, trying to process what I'd just seen. Then it started moving again, but not down. Sideways, slow, smooth, not blinking, not changing, but just drifting across the sky at a steady pace. I pushed myself up into a sitting position. The chair creaked slightly under me. The sound felt louder than it should have. I kept watching the light, trying to match it to something familiar. Plane, drone, satellite, none of it fit. Planes blink, drones wobble, or at least adjust. Satellites don't stop and change direction like that. This thing just moved, deliberate, controlled. I stood up. The grass felt damp under my feet. I didn't take my eyes off it. The light continued drifting sideways. Then it slowed, not gradually, just less movement, until it almost stopped again. Hovered there, then it pulsed. Once, very faint. At the same time I felt it, a slight pressure in my ears, like when you go up an elevation too quickly. I swallowed. It didn't clear. I shifted my stance. The pressure stayed. I looked around the garden quickly. Everything else was normal. Fence, shed, the faint outline of my neighbor's roof. I looked back up. The light was still there, still hovering. I tried to focus on it directly. The moment I did, it seemed to dim slightly, like it slipped out of clarity. I looked slightly to the side. It became more visible again. I frowned, trying to keep track of it without staring straight at it. The pressure in my ears increased. Not painful, just there. A steady weight. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal. That was unusual. I always had at least some signal in the garden. I looked at the time. It didn't register properly, like my brain didn't want to process it. I looked back up. The light shifted again, not smoothly this time. It jumped, just slightly, a small, sudden repositioning. Then it held steady. I felt a slight tension in my chest. Not fear, just confusion building. I took a step backward. The grass crunched faintly. The sound felt delayed somehow, like it reached me a fraction of a second late. I stopped moving. Listened. Everything sounded off. Duller. Flattened. I looked back up. The light pulsed again. Slightly brighter this time. Then it started moving, not sideways, up, straight up. Faster than before. No acceleration. Just an instant change. One moment it was hovering. Then it was rising. I tracked it as best I could. It got smaller, dimmer, until it blended with the stars. Then it was gone. The pressure in my ears eased. Gradually, the normal sounds came back, faint at first, then clearer. I stood there for a moment, staring at the sky, trying to find it again. Nothing stood out, just the usual scatter of stars. I looked down at my phone again. Signal returned, full bars. I checked the time properly this time. It didn't make sense. I was sure I'd only been outside for about 20 minutes. The phone said over an hour had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then I looked back up one last time. The sky looked completely normal. No movement, no strange lights. But the way that thing had dropped, stopped, then moved sideways, felt less like something flying and more like something adjusting its position. I noticed it because my breath shouldn't have been visible. It was warm out. Not hot, but warm enough that I'd been sitting around in just a t-shirt all evening. I was camping in a small patch of woodland just off a trail near Kinder Scout. Nothing too remote, but far enough that once it got dark, it felt properly isolated. I'd set up just before sunset, cooked something simple, sat by a small fire for a bit, then let it die down to embers. By the time I crawled into the tent, the air still felt mild. No chill, no reason for condensation or anything like that. I woke up sometime in the night, not suddenly, just drifted awake. The kind of wake up where nothing's wrong, but you're not asleep anymore either. I was lying on my back, looking up at the inside of the tent. It was quiet. Too quiet. No wind through the trees, no insects. Nothing. I lay there for a minute, listening. Then I exhaled and saw it, a faint cloud in front of my face. I blinked, exhaled again, another one, soft, visible breath, like it was cold. I frowned, pushing myself up onto my elbows. The air didn't feel cold, my skin wasn't reacting. No goosebumps, no chill. But every time I breathed out, I could see it. I reached out slightly, moving my hand through the space. The air felt normal. I sat up fully. The sleeping bag rustled softly. The sound felt muted somehow, like it wasn't carrying properly. I unzipped the tent slowly. The fabric made that low dragging sound. Again, it felt off. Duller than it should have been. I opened the flap and leaned out. The woods were dark. No moon. Just that faint ambient light that lets you see shapes but nothing clearly. I breathed out again. Another cloud, clear as anything. I looked around. The trees stood still. No movement. No sound. That's when I saw the light. It wasn't bright, just a faint flicker. Between the trees, maybe 20 or 30 meters away, at first, I thought it was someone else, another camper. But it didn't behave like a torch or a fire. It flickered irregularly, not steady, not rhythmic, just appearing and fading. I stayed still, watching it. My breath continued to fog in front of me. Each exhale drifting slowly, lingering longer than it should have. I stepped out of the tent. The ground felt normal under my boots, dry, no frost, no damp. I looked down briefly. No mist near the ground, just around my breath. I looked back at the light. It was still there, faint, flickering, not moving, just present. I took a step forward. The leaves crunched slightly underfoot. The sound felt delayed, like it reached me a fraction too late. I stopped. Listened, nothing else. No animals, no wind, just that quiet. I took another step. The light flickered again, slightly brighter this time, then dimmer. I tried to focus on it directly. The moment I did, it seemed to weaken, like it slipped out of clarity. I looked slightly to the side. It became more visible again. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not lining up. I took another step forward. The breath in front of me grew thicker, more defined, like the air in front of me was colder than the rest. I reached out slowly. The air still felt warm on my skin, but my breath kept fogging. I looked back toward the tent briefly. It looked normal, still, silent. I turned back to the trees. The light flickered again, then shifted, not across the ground, just deeper between the trees, like it had moved back without actually traveling. I stepped forward again. The pressure in my ears started, subtle, like a change in altitude. I swallowed. It didn't clear. The light flickered faster now, still faint, still not illuminating anything around it, just existing. I took one more step, then stopped. Something about the space ahead felt wrong, not visually, just the sense of it. Like the distance between me and the trees wasn't consistent. I stood there breathing slowly, watching the light. Then it dimmed, gradually. The flicker slowed, the brightness dropped until it was barely there, then gone. No fade into darkness, just gone. The woods returned to normal, shapes, shadows, nothing else. I stood there for a moment, waiting, my breath still visible, still fogging in front of me. Then slowly, it stopped. The clouds grew thinner, fainter, until they were gone. I exhaled again. Nothing. Just normal air. The pressure in my ears eased. The sounds came back, faint at first, then clearer. Leaves shifting somewhere in the distance. A bird. The usual night noise. I stayed out there for a bit longer, looking at the spot where the light had been. Nothing returned. Eventually, I went back into the tent, zipped it up, lay down again. Everything felt normal. The air, the sounds, the space. But I didn't sleep much after that. Every now and then, I'd exhale slowly, just to check, half expecting to see it again. Like the air in front of me wasn't always the same. I noticed it because the light didn't reach it. I was driving back late from seeing a mate out near Buxton. Took the smaller road instead of the main route because there'd been an accident earlier and everything was backed up. It was one of those nights where the fog sits low but thick in patches. Not constant, just drifting banks of it that swallow sections of the road and then clear again. My headlights were on full beam, cutting through most of it fine. The road was empty, no other cars, no houses nearby, just hedges and open land on either side. I'd been driving like that for maybe 15 minutes when I saw it. At first it didn't look like anything, just a darker section ahead, like a thicker patch of fog. But as I got closer, I realized it wasn't fog. It was a shape, a silhouette, positioned right in the middle of the road. Where headlights should have reflected off something, they didn't. The light just stopped, didn't bounce, didn't scatter. It hit that space and vanished. I eased off the accelerator slightly, trying to understand what I was seeing. The shape didn't move, didn't flicker. It just sat there, dark, flat, like a cutout in the world. I leaned forward a bit, squinting, trying to define the edges, but the more I looked, the harder it was to focus on. It wasn't sharp, but it wasn't blurry either, just absent, like my eyes couldn't lock onto it properly. I slowed down more, down to maybe 30. The fog around it shifted slightly with the wind, but the silhouette stayed the same, unaffected. I rolled the window down a crack. Cold air came in, damp, still, no sound, no engine, no movement. I kept watching it, trying to match it to something normal. A parked car, a person, anything. But it didn't reflect any light, didn't cast any shadow. It just absorbed everything. I tapped the brake lightly. The car slowed further. The headlights shifted angles slightly. For a moment, the silhouette became more noticeable, like the change in light revealed its surface, smooth, curved, but only for a second. Then it went back to that same undefined darkness. I felt that quiet tension settle in. Not fear, just something not lining up. I glanced at my mirrors. Nothing behind me. Empty road. I looked forward again. The silhouette was still there. Same position. Same size. I slowed almost to a stop, the car idling quietly. The fog thickened slightly around the edges of the beam. But the silhouette didn't change. I checked my phone quickly. No signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but it stood out. I looked at the time. It didn't register properly, like my brain skipped over it. I lowered the phone, looked back up. The silhouette seemed closer now, not because it moved, because I had. But something about it felt different, like the distance wasn't behaving properly. I took my foot off the brake slightly, let the car roll forward, slow, careful. The headlights stretched further, the fog thinned slightly, and then it was gone, not moving, not fading, just gone. The space ahead filled in instantly. The road was empty, normal. The light reached all the way down again like nothing had ever been there. I braked fully. The car stopped. I stared ahead, trying to find any trace of it. Nothing. Just road, fog drifting lightly. I opened the door and stepped out. The air felt cold, quiet, normal. I walked a few steps forward. The gravel crunched under my shoes. The sound felt slightly delayed. I stopped where I thought the silhouette had been. Looked down. Nothing. Just tarmac. I looked around. The hedges, the fields beyond. All normal. I looked back toward the car, headlights still on, illuminating the road evenly. No gaps, no dark shapes. I stood there for a moment, waiting. Nothing came back. The fog continued drifting. Thin, unremarkable. I got back in the car, closed the door. The inside felt quieter than before. I checked the time again. This time it registered. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only slowed down for a minute or two. The clock said nearly 10 minutes had passed. I sat there, trying to piece it together. Then I drove on. The rest of the road was empty. No more shapes, no more interruptions, just fog and headlights. But the way that silhouette had been there, not blocking the light, just removing it, felt less like something standing in the road and more like something the road had passed through for a moment. I noticed it because the water went too still. I'd been fishing out at a small reservoir just outside Macclesfield. It's not a busy place, especially midweek, and definitely not early evening like that. I'd finished work late and figured I'd get an hour or two in before it got fully dark. The weather had been warm all day, but it cooled off fast once the sun dropped. No wind. The surface of the water was already starting to flatten out, just the occasional ripple from insects touching down. I was set up on one of the quieter banks, away from the main path. No one else in sight, just me, the rod, and that steady quiet. I'd been there maybe 40 minutes when I noticed it. At first, it wasn't the light, it was the line. It stopped moving, not tightening or pulling, just still. Even with the slight drift you normally get from the water, it held in place like something had anchored it. I leaned forward slightly, watching the float. It wasn't bobbing, wasn't dipping, just sitting there, perfectly still. That's when I saw it, a soft white glow, beneath the surface, directly under where my line went into the water. I frowned, trying to focus on it. It wasn't bright, didn't light up the water around it, just a faint, contained glow, like something was sitting just under the surface, holding its own light. I leaned closer to the edge. The bank crunched slightly under my boots. The sound felt louder than it should have. The glow didn't react, didn't flicker, didn't move. It just stayed there, perfectly still. I tried to match it to something normal, reflected light, maybe from a distant house, but there weren't any lights behind me, and the surface wasn't reflecting anything. The glow wasn't on the water, it was in it, just below the surface. I shifted my position slightly, changing the angle. The glow didn't change, didn't distort. It stayed in the same place, same shape, same intensity. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not adding up. I glanced around. Still no one else, no movement along the path, no sounds. Even the insects had gone quiet. I looked back at the water. The glow was still there. My float hadn't moved. The line was still straight down. I reached out slowly and touched the rod. The vibration felt normal. No pull, no tension, just weight. I lifted the rod slightly. The line tightened. The float shifted a fraction, but the glow didn't move. It stayed exactly where it was. I lowered the rod again. The float settled. The glow remained. I swallowed, feeling a slight pressure in my ears. Subtle, like the air had thickened. I leaned even closer, trying to see beneath the surface. The water was dark, too dark to see anything clearly, but the glow sat there, unchanging. Then I noticed something else. The surface around it wasn't behaving normally. There were no ripples, not even the tiny ones you get from insects or slight air movement. It was flat, perfectly flat, only in that small area. I shifted my weight again. A small pebble slipped from the bank and dropped into the water a few feet away. The ripple spread outward, but when it reached the edge of the glowing area, it stopped, not gradually, just ended. The surface inside stayed undisturbed. I froze, watching it. The pressure in my ears increased slightly, a dull, steady weight. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but it still stood out. I looked at the time. It didn't register properly, like my brain didn't want to focus on it. I lowered the phone, looked back at the water. The glow hadn't changed, still perfectly still. Then it dimmed, not quickly, just slightly, like it had dropped in intensity. I leaned forward, trying to hold on to it. The more I focused, the harder it was to see. It started to fade. Not spreading, not moving, just losing brightness. The edges softened, the center dulled, until it was barely there, then gone. The water returned to normal. Ripples spread naturally again. The slight movement came back. The float bobbed once, then settled. I stood there for a second, staring at the spot, waiting. Nothing came back. The pressure in my ears eased slowly. The distant sounds returned, a bird somewhere, a faint breeze brushing the surface. I checked my phone again. Signal came back, full bars. I looked at the time properly this time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only been watching it for a minute or two. The phone said nearly 20 minutes had passed. I packed up not long after that. Didn't catch anything. Didn't really try. As I walked back along the path, I kept glancing over my shoulder. The water looked normal. Dark. Still. But the way that light had stayed, perfectly still beneath the surface, like it wasn't affected by anything above it, felt less like something in the water and more like something just beneath where the water ended. I first noticed it because I couldn't place the rhythm. I was walking back from a late shift, taking the longer route through a quieter part of town. It cuts behind a row of houses, then follows a narrow path along an open stretch before looping back toward the main road. It was late, maybe around 11:30. No wind, no traffic, just that steady quiet you get when everything's settled. I'd been walking for a few minutes when I heard it, a soft clicking sound, evenly spaced, not loud, just there. Click, pause, click, pause. I slowed down slightly, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It didn't sound close, but it didn't sound far either. I stopped walking. The clicking continued. Same rhythm. Click, pause, click. I turned my head slightly, listening. It didn't shift direction, didn't get louder or quieter. It just stayed the same. I looked up. It stopped. Completely. The silence that followed felt heavier than it should have. I stood there for a second, staring at the sky. Nothing. Just darkness and a few faint stars. I lowered my gaze, waited, then it started again. Click, pause, click, same pattern. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not lining up. I started walking again, slow, careful. The clicking kept pace, not with my steps, just continuing. I glanced up again, it stopped, instantly, like it had been switched off. I frowned and looked back down, waited. Then it resumed. Click, pause, click. I kept walking, trying to ignore it, but it stayed with me. Consistent, unchanging. I checked my phone out of habit, no signal. That wasn't unusual in that area, but it still stood out. I looked ahead, the path stretched out empty, no one else around. I slowed again, the clicking continued. Then I tried something. I kept my head down, didn't look up, just listened. The sound stayed steady. Click, pause, click. Then I glanced up quickly, just for a second. It stopped. The silence hit again. I looked back down, waited. It came back. Same rhythm. I felt the air shift slightly. Not wind, just pressure, subtle, in my ears. I swallowed. It didn't clear. I kept walking. The clicking continued, unchanged. Then I noticed something else. It wasn't echoing, not bouncing off anything, just a flat, direct sound. Like it wasn't traveling through space the way sound should. I stopped again, kept my head down. The clicking continued. I listened closely. Trying to count the timing, it was consistent, almost mechanical. Click, pause, click. The pauses were identical, precise. I took a step forward, then another. The rhythm didn't change. I glanced up again. It stopped. I held my gaze there this time, looking straight up. The sky looked normal, empty. The silence pressed in. Then I lowered my head. The clicking returned. I exhaled slowly. Then I tried something else. I kept my head tilted up, but didn't focus directly above. Looked just off to the side. The clicking hesitated, not a full stop, just a slight break in the rhythm. Then it resumed, softer, less defined. I shifted my eyes slightly. The sound weakened. Then I looked directly up. It stopped again, completely. I stood there, staring, waiting, nothing. I looked back down. The clicking came back, but this time it felt closer, not louder, just nearer. The pressure in my ears increased slightly, a dull, steady weight. I started walking again, faster this time. The clicking kept pace, still even, still precise. I checked my phone again, no signal. I looked at the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only been walking for a few minutes. The phone said nearly 20 had passed. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. Then I heard it change. The rhythm shifted, just slightly. The pauses shortened. Click, click, pause, click. It wasn't random, still structured, just different. I looked up again. It stopped. The silence hit harder this time. I lowered my head quickly. The clicking didn't return immediately. I stood there waiting. Then, click, a single one. Then, nothing. I kept walking. The rest of the path felt longer than it should have. No more clicking, no more changes, just the normal quiet. When I reached the main road, the sound of distant traffic came back. The air felt normal again. The pressure in my ears eased. I checked my phone. Signal returned. Full bars. I looked at the time again. It didn't line up with how long the walk should have taken. I stood there for a moment, looking back toward the path. Nothing. Just darkness. No sound, no movement. But the thing that stayed with me was how the clicking only existed when I wasn't looking at it. Like it needed me not to see it, to keep going. I noticed it because I thought a car was passing outside. You know how headlights sometimes catch the edges of your room through the curtains and move across the ceiling? That's what it felt like at first. I was lying on my back, not fully asleep yet, just staring at the ceiling, half thinking about the day, half drifting off. The room was dark, curtains closed, no lights on. Then something shifted above me, faint, barely there. I assumed it was just light from outside. But it didn't move the way headlights usually do. It didn't sweep across in one smooth motion. It moved slower, more deliberate. I narrowed my eyes, trying to focus. That's when I realized it wasn't a solid light. It was a pattern. Very faint, like a grid, thin lines crossing each other, forming small squares. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks. The pattern stayed. It drifted slowly across the ceiling, not from one side of the room to the other, just moving. As if it wasn't tied to any direction. I stayed still, watching it. The lines weren't bright, just slightly lighter than the darkness around them. Enough to see, not enough to illuminate anything. I lifted my head slightly, trying to get a better angle. The moment I focused directly on it, it became harder to see, like it slipped just out of clarity. I relaxed my eyes, looked slightly to the side. It came back. The grid was still there, still moving, slow, steady. I felt that quiet tension settle in. Not fear, just something not making sense. I turned my head slightly toward the window. The curtains hadn't moved. No light was coming through. I looked back up. The grid continued its slow drift. I couldn't tell where it started or ended. It didn't reach the walls, just existed across the center of the ceiling, like it was projected there, but softer, less defined. I listened. No sound. The room felt quieter than it should have. Even my breathing sounded dull. I reached for my phone on the bedside table, turned the screen on. The light from it filled the room. I looked back at the ceiling. Nothing. Just plain darkness. I turned the phone off. The room dropped back into shadow. The grid returned, exactly where it had been. Still moving. I sat up slightly, propped myself on one elbow, watching it. The movement didn't change. It didn't react to me. It just kept drifting. I checked the time on my phone again. 1:19. That felt right, maybe. I wasn't sure. I looked back up. The grid slowed, almost stopped. The lines became fainter. I squinted, trying to hold on to it, to see it properly. The moment I focused harder, it faded. Not quickly, just gradually, like it was slipping away. The lines thinned, the squares broke apart. Then it was gone. The ceiling was just dark again. I lay there for a few seconds, waiting. Nothing came back. I turned my head toward the window again, still closed. No movement. I sat up fully this time, swung my legs over the side of the bed. The floor felt normal, cool, solid. I stood up and looked around the room. Everything looked the same, nothing out of place. I reached up and touched the ceiling above where the pattern had been. Nothing, just the usual texture. I went back to bed and lay down again, stared at the ceiling. Nothing, just darkness. I checked my phone one more time, 1:47. That didn't make sense. I was sure only a few minutes had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then I turned the phone off again. The room went dark. I stared up, half expecting the grid to come back. It didn't. The ceiling stayed empty. Eventually, I closed my eyes, tried to sleep, but every now and then I'd open them again, just to check. Nothing. Just darkness. But the way the pattern had moved, not like light, not like reflection, felt like it hadn't been on the ceiling at all. More like it had been between me and it. I noticed it because the fog didn't look right. It was one of those early morning drives, just before sunrise, when everything's quiet and the roads are empty. I was cutting through farmland to get to a job out near Wilmslow, taking the smaller roads to avoid the motorway. There was fog, but not heavy. Just low, patchy stuff sitting over the fields, drifting slowly across the road in places. My headlights cut through it fine. Nothing unusual at first. I had the radio low, barely paying attention, just following the road. Then I saw the glow. At first, I thought it was headlights from another car somewhere ahead, maybe dipping behind a hill or something. But it wasn't above the fog, it was under it. A soft light spreading across the ground beneath the mist. Not bright, just enough to make the fog look like it was lit from below. I slowed down slightly, trying to figure out where it was coming from. There were no buildings nearby, no houses, just open fields on both sides. The glow moved, slowly, but not with the fog. The fog was drifting left, pushed by a light breeze. The glow moved right, against it. I frowned, leaning forward slightly. The light didn't flicker, didn't change intensity, just glided under the fog like something moving beneath the surface. I eased off the accelerator, the car slowed, the headlights stretched further ahead. The glow became clearer. It wasn't a single point, more like a patch. Diffuse, soft-edged, but distinct from the darkness around it. I rolled the window down a bit. Cold air came in, damp, quiet, no sound, no engine, no hum, nothing. The glow kept moving. Still against the direction of the fog, I checked my mirrors out of habit. Nothing behind me. Empty road. I looked ahead again. The glow had shifted further across the field. Keeping a steady pace, I tapped the brake lightly. The car slowed to maybe 30. The glow didn't react, didn't change speed, just kept moving. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not lining up. I kept watching it, trying to match it to something real. Vehicle lights, machinery, anything. But there was nothing, no shapes, no silhouettes, just that soft light beneath the fog. Then it changed direction, not gradually, it just turned. The movement shifted from right to left, still under the fog, still smooth, still silent. I felt a slight pressure in my ears, subtle, like when you're driving up a hill. I swallowed. It didn't clear. I slowed down more, the car almost coasting now. The glow moved closer to the road, not directly toward me, just drifting in that direction. I gripped the steering wheel a bit tighter, watching it. The fog above it thickened slightly, or maybe it just looked that way because of the light. I couldn't tell. The pressure in my ears increased, a dull, steady weight. I checked my phone quickly. No signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but it stood out. I looked back at the field. The glow was closer now. Still no shape, still no source, just that light, moving. Then it stopped, right near the edge of the field, close to the road. I slowed to a near stop. The headlights illuminated the grass ahead, but the glow didn't reflect off anything. It didn't brighten the ground. It just existed beneath the fog. Separate. I stared at it, trying to force my eyes to see something more. Anything. Then it shifted again. Not across the field. Up. Not into the sky. Just up into the fog. The light rose slightly. The fog above it lit up for a moment. Then the glow faded, not quickly, just gradually, like it was being dimmed. The pressure in my ears eased, slowly. The fog returned to its normal dull gray. No light beneath it. Nothing moving. I sat there for a few seconds, engine idling, listening. The world felt quiet again, normal. I checked the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only slowed down for a minute, maybe 2. The clock said nearly 15 had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then I looked back at the field. Nothing, just fog, drifting with the wind. I pulled the car forward slowly. Drove past the spot. The headlights lit the ground normally. No glow, no movement, just empty field. But the way the light had moved, not with the fog, not with anything visible, felt less like something on the ground and more like something just beneath where I could see. I noticed it because the road just stopped. Not physically, but the way my headlights hit it changed for a second. I'd been driving with full beams on, the road stretching out ahead the way it always does on those long, empty lanes. Hedgerows on both sides, nothing but fields beyond them. It was late, close to 1 a.m. No other cars, no houses nearby, just that narrow strip of road and whatever my headlights could reach. Then, for a split second, the light didn't go any further. It didn't bounce back, it didn't fade into the distance. It just ended, like something was there, blocking it completely. I instinctively eased off the accelerator, and that's when I saw it, not clearly. Just enough, a shape above the road, hanging there, perfectly still. It wasn't outlined, didn't catch the light. It absorbed it. That's the only way I can describe it. My headlights hit it, and instead of reflecting, the light just disappeared into it. No shine, no glare. Just a flat, dark surface that shouldn't have been visible at all, but was, because everything else around it was lit. I leaned forward slightly, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The edges were hard to define. Not blurry, just not there. Like my eyes couldn't settle on where it ended. I slowed down more, down to maybe 25. The shape stayed in the same position, above the road, too low to be anything like a plane, too high to be attached to anything. No wires, no structure, just hanging there. I rolled the window down a bit. Cold air came in, no sound, no hum, nothing. The road ahead felt wrong, like it was cut off. I kept my eyes fixed on that space, trying to track the shape. The more I looked directly at it, the harder it was to see, but I could still feel it there, that absence of reflection, that gap in the light. I tapped the brake lightly. The car slowed further. The headlights shifted slightly as the angle changed. For a second, the surface became more noticeable, a smooth curve, not flat, not sharp, just a gentle, continuous shape. Then it moved, not across the road, not away from me, up, straight upward, no acceleration, no buildup. One moment it was there, then it wasn't. Gone. The headlights reached the road again. Normal. The space ahead filled back in like nothing had been there. I braked harder than I meant to. The car slowed to almost a stop. I stared through the windshield. Nothing. Just empty road. I opened the door and stepped out. The cold hit me immediately. The air felt still. Too still. I looked up. Nothing. Just sky. Dark, clear, empty. I turned slowly, scanning above me. There was no sign of anything. No movement. No light. No sound. I stood there for maybe 20 seconds. Waiting. Listening. Nothing changed. I got back into the car and shut the door. The inside felt quieter than before, like the sound hadn't fully returned yet. I looked at the dashboard. Everything normal. I checked the time. It didn't match. I'd glanced at it not long before. It had been around 12:52. Now it read 1:08. That didn't make sense. I hadn't been stopped that long. I tried to think back. The shape, the movement. It had taken seconds, not minutes. I sat there for a moment longer. Then I started driving again. Slow at first, then gradually picking up speed. The road ahead looked normal. The light reached as far as it should. Nothing blocked it. I kept glancing upward through the windshield. Nothing. No shapes, no gaps, just empty sky. The rest of the drive passed without anything unusual. When I got home, I parked and sat there with the engine off, looking out at the street. Everything felt normal again. The quiet sounded right, but the way that thing had taken the light, not reflected it, not cast a shadow, just removed it, stuck with me. It hadn't been dark like something unlit. It had been dark like the light didn't exist there at all. I noticed it because the glass in the kitchen cabinets started to hum. Not loudly, just a faint, steady vibration, like when a heavy lorry goes past. But there were no cars on the road at that hour. It was just after 2 a.m. and the whole street had been quiet for hours. I was downstairs because I couldn't sleep, just sitting at the table with the lights off, scrolling on my phone, trying not to wake anyone else up. At first, I thought it was in my head. That kind of low, barely there sound you only notice when everything else is silent. But then the glassware in the cabinet gave that slight rattle again. I looked up, held still, listened. There it was. Not really a sound you hear, more like something you feel, a low vibration, steady, even. I put my phone down and stood up slowly. The floor didn't shake, nothing visible moved, but the feeling was there, in the air, in my chest, like standing near something large that you can't quite see. I walked over to the sink and looked out the back window. The garden was dark, still, nothing moving. I listened again. The vibration continued. Then it shifted, not in tone, in position. It felt like it was moving from one side of the house to the other, slowly, like something passing overhead. I stepped closer to the window. The glass felt normal, cold, still. But the vibration grew slightly stronger, not louder, just closer. I tilted my head up, trying to listen through the ceiling. Nothing distinct. No engine, no rotor, no sound I could identify, just that steady pressure-like hum. I stepped back and looked at the ceiling. The light fixture didn't move, the shadows didn't shift, everything looked normal, but the vibration kept drifting, now directly above. I felt it more clearly then, in my ears, like a change in pressure. I swallowed. It didn't clear. I walked into the hallway, the sound followed, or maybe I was just moving with it, I couldn't tell. I stood in the middle of the house, looking up, waiting. The vibration held steady for a few seconds, then it moved again, toward the front of the house. I followed it, slowly, trying to stay underneath it. The feeling intensified slightly as I moved, like I was tracking something. I reached the front room and looked out through the curtains. The street was empty, no headlights, no movement. I cracked the curtain slightly and peered out. Nothing. Just parked cars and dark houses. The vibration continued, now just beyond the front of the house. Still moving, still steady. I stepped closer to the window. The pressure in my ears increased, a dull, consistent weight. I looked up through the glass. The sky was dark. No clouds, no lights, nothing. But the feeling was right there, just above, passing over. I held my breath, listening, trying to catch any detail. There wasn't one. No change in pitch, no fluctuation, just that constant, even vibration. Then it began to fade, not abruptly, just gradually. Like it was moving further away. The pressure in my ears eased with it, slowly. The hum became less noticeable. Then it was gone, completely. The house fell back into silence, normal silence. I stood there for a moment, waiting. Nothing came back. I checked my phone, no signal. That was unusual. I always had signal inside. I looked at the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only been standing there for a minute or two. The phone said nearly 10 minutes had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then the signal came back. Full bars. I walked back into the kitchen. Everything looked the same, nothing out of place. But I noticed something else. The clock on the wall had stopped, just briefly. The second hand wasn't moving. I stared at it. Then it ticked forward again, like nothing had happened. I stood there for a while longer, listening. The house sounded normal. The faint hum of the fridge, the occasional creak, nothing else. But the way that vibration had moved, not like sound, not like anything mechanical, felt less like something passing over the house, and more like something passing just above where the air stopped. I noticed it because my ears popped like I'd just changed altitude. I was just standing outside, nothing unusual about it. It was late, maybe around half 11, and I'd stepped out into the back garden to take a call. The house was stuffy, and it was one of those nights where the air felt thick inside. Outside was better, cooler, still, no wind. Clouds moving slowly across the sky, but high up, barely noticeable unless you actually looked for them. I just ended the call and stayed out there for a minute, leaning against the fence, not really thinking about anything. Then it happened. A sudden pressure shift. Both ears at once. That familiar pop, like when you're on a plane or going up a steep hill. I swallowed instinctively. It didn't clear. I frowned and tilted my head slightly, trying to equalize it. Nothing. The pressure stayed. Not painful. Just there. A dull, steady weight. I looked up without really meaning to. The clouds were still moving slowly, normal, but something was off. I couldn't place it at first. Then I saw the light. It wasn't bright, just a dim point, moving, gliding between the clouds, not through gaps, between them, like it was behind the clouds but still visible. I narrowed my eyes trying to focus on it. It didn't blink, didn't change brightness, just moved, slow, smooth, completely silent. I pushed myself off the fence and stood properly upright, watching it, trying to match it to something normal. A plane maybe, but there were no navigation lights, no blinking, and the movement was wrong, too steady, too controlled. The pressure in my ears increased slightly. I swallowed again. It still didn't clear. I took a step forward into the garden. The grass was damp under my feet. The sound of it felt muted somehow, like it wasn't carrying properly. I looked back up. The light continued its path, cutting between the clouds. It didn't illuminate them, didn't cast any glow, just existed against them. I tried to look directly at it. The moment I focused fully, it dimmed. Not gone, just harder to see. I shifted my gaze slightly to the side. It came back into clarity. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not lining up. I stood there, tracking it. The movement didn't change, didn't speed up or slow down, just continued. Then it stopped, midway across the sky, completely still. The pressure in my ears deepened. I felt it behind my eyes as well, subtle. But there, I held my breath without realizing it, watching, waiting. The light didn't flicker, didn't move, just held there. Then it shifted, not gradually, just changed direction from left to right, then upward. A slight angle, still silent. I felt a slight vibration in my chest. Not a sound, more like a physical sensation. Then the light pulsed, once, very faint. At the same moment, the pressure in my ears peaked. A sharp, quick pop. Then it eased. I exhaled slowly, didn't realize I'd been holding it. The light continued moving upward now, faster than before. Not accelerating, just faster, like it had switched speed instantly. I tracked it as best I could. It grew smaller, fainter. Then it reached the edge of the cloud layer and was gone. No fade, no trail, just gone. The sky returned to normal. Clouds drifting slowly, nothing else. The pressure in my ears settled completely. The air felt normal again. The sounds came back. Distant traffic, a dog barking somewhere far off. I stood there for a moment, looking at the empty space, trying to understand what I'd seen. I checked my phone out of habit. No signal. That was unusual. I always had signal in the garden. I looked at the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only been standing there for a couple of minutes. The phone said nearly 15 had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then the signal came back. Full bars. I looked back up one last time. The sky looked completely normal. Nothing out of place. But the way that pressure had come on, before I even saw the light, felt less like a reaction to something passing overhead, and more like something passing through the space I was standing in. I noticed it because the reflection didn't make sense. I was driving back late from a job out near the Peak District, taking a narrow road that cuts between long stretches of open land. No streetlights, no houses nearby, just hedges and fields and the occasional gate. It was one of those clear nights where the sky feels bigger than usual. You can see stars properly, not just a few faint ones. I had my full beams on, just watching the road ahead and trying to stay focused. I'd been driving for a while, starting to get that dull, tired feeling where everything blends together. Then something caught the light. Not on the road, not in front of me, above, high enough that it shouldn't have been affected by my headlights at all. For a split second, I saw a reflection, sharp, metallic, like light hitting a curved surface. I instinctively leaned forward, eyes snapping upward through the windshield. There was something there, not clearly visible, just a shape, dark against the sky, but outlined for a moment by that reflection. It wasn't large, but it wasn't small either, and it wasn't moving like anything I recognized. It hovered, perfectly still. I eased off the accelerator without thinking. The car slowed slightly. My headlights shifted angle just a bit. The reflection disappeared, but the shape remained, barely, like I could only see it because I knew where it was. I squinted, trying to focus. The edges didn't hold. Every time I tried to look directly at it, it slipped slightly out of clarity, but I could tell it was there. Something smooth, curved, suspended in the air. No sound, no movement. I rolled the window down a little. Cold air came in, still, quiet, nothing else. I kept my eyes on that spot, trying to understand what I was looking at. It didn't blink, didn't shift, just held there. Then it changed, not position, orientation. It tilted, slightly, like something adjusting its angle. The surface caught the light again for a fraction of a second. A brief, sharp glint, then darkness. I felt that quiet tension settle in, not fear, just something not lining up. I slowed the car more, down to maybe 30. My focus locked on that space, trying to keep it in view. The shape held for another second, then it moved. Not across the sky, not drifting. Up, straight up, no build-up, no acceleration curve. One moment it was there, then it shot upward, gone, just gone. The space it had occupied emptied instantly. The sky looked normal again, stars, nothing else. I braked harder than I meant to. The car slowed sharply. I stared up through the windshield, trying to track it. Nothing, no trail, no fading light, just empty sky. I pulled over to the side of the road, engine still running, lights still on. I stepped out. The air felt colder outside. Sharper. I looked up, scanning the sky. Nothing, no movement, no reflection, no sign anything had been there. I turned slowly, checking different angles. Still nothing. I listened. No sound. Not even the usual distant hum you sometimes get from planes. Just quiet. I stood there for maybe a minute. Then I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual out there, but it still stood out. I looked at the time. It didn't match. I was sure the whole thing had lasted maybe 10 seconds. The phone said nearly 5 minutes had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then I got back into the car, closed the door. The inside felt quieter than before, like the sound hadn't fully come back yet. I sat there for a second, looking up through the windshield again. Nothing. Then I pulled back onto the road. The rest of the drive was uneventful. No more reflections, no more shapes, just the road and the dark and the steady beam of my headlights. But the way it had tilted, just slightly before moving, stuck with me. It didn't feel like something reacting to light. It felt like something reacting to being seen. I noticed it while I was still inside. At first, I thought it was just something electrical, like a fridge or a transformer outside, but it didn't sound like anything I recognized. It wasn't really a sound, more like a feeling, a low hum that sat behind everything else. I was in the living room, lights off, just scrolling on my phone. It was late, maybe close to midnight. The house was quiet, nothing unusual. Then that pressure started, subtle, like a faint vibration you can't quite hear but can feel. I paused what I was doing and sat there for a second, trying to place it. It wasn't coming from one direction. It felt like it was above me, not directly overhead, just up there. I stood up slowly and listened. The house was still, no pipes, no appliances kicking in, just that same low, steady presence. I walked toward the window, pulled the curtain aside slightly, looked out. The street was empty, no cars, no people, nothing moving. But the feeling didn't go away. If anything, it got a little stronger. I felt it in my ears, like a pressure building. I swallowed. It didn't clear. I stood there for another few seconds, trying to decide if I was imagining it. Then I went to the front door and opened it. The moment I stepped outside, everything stopped. Not just the hum, everything. The air, the usual distant traffic, even the faint rustle of leaves, gone. It wasn't quiet. It was empty. Like the sound had been taken out of the space, I froze on the doorstep, half inside, half outside, listening. Nothing. No wind. No insects. Nothing. I stepped fully outside, closed the door behind me. The silence stayed. The pressure in my ears increased slightly, not painful, just noticeable. I looked up. The sky was clear. No clouds, no movement, just stars. But something about it felt off. like it was deeper than it should have been. I stood there for a moment, trying to adjust. The street looked exactly the same, but it didn't feel right. I took a few steps down the path, my footsteps made no sound, or at least I couldn't hear them. I stopped walking, stood still. The silence pressed in. I looked up again, trying to find anything, any movement, any light. There was nothing obvious. Then I felt it shift. That pressure, it changed slightly. Moved. Not downward, just adjusted. Like whatever it was had shifted position. I held my breath. The silence stayed. Complete. Then, faintly, I saw something. Not a light, not clearly, just a slight distortion, high above, barely visible against the sky, like a patch where the stars didn't line up quite right. I stared at it, trying to focus. The moment I did, it became harder to see, like it slipped out of clarity. I looked slightly to the side. It became more noticeable again, a faint, uneven patch, moving slowly, not across the sky, just adjusting. I felt the pressure peak, a dull weight in my ears and chest. Then it stopped, completely. The distortion vanished, and the sound came back, all at once. Wind. Distant traffic, the faint rustle of leaves. It rushed back in like it had been waiting. I flinched slightly at the sudden noise, looked around. Everything looked normal again. The street, the sky, nothing out of place. I stood there for a few seconds, trying to process it. Then I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual for a moment or two, but it still stood out. I looked at the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd only been outside for a minute, maybe two. The phone said it had been closer to 15. I frowned, trying to make sense of it. Then the signal came back. Full bars. Like nothing had happened. I looked up one more time. The sky looked normal. Stars in place. No distortion. No movement. I went back inside and closed the door. The house felt normal. The quiet sounded right. But that feeling, that pressure, didn't fully leave right away. It faded slowly, like whatever had been above had taken a moment to move away. I noticed the compass first. It wasn't anything dramatic at the start, just a slight drift, like the needle couldn't quite settle. I'd stopped on the ridge to get my bearings, more out of habit than necessity. The path was pretty clear, just a narrow trail cutting along the top, with a steep drop on one side and a slope of scrub and rock on the other. It was late afternoon when I'd started, but by the time I reached that section, it was getting into dusk. Not dark yet, but the light was fading fast, that dull gray-blue you get before everything drops off. I pulled the compass out of my jacket and held it flat. The needle wobbled. I waited. Normally it snaps into place within a second or two. This one kept drifting slightly past north, then easing back, then drifting again. Not spinning. Just off. I frowned and turned my body slightly, thinking maybe I was affecting it somehow. Same thing. I took a step to the side, away from the rocks, held it out again, still drifting. I tapped the casing lightly. The needle flicked, then started its slow, uneven movement again. That's when I started paying attention. Up until then, everything had felt normal. Wind moving across the ridge, distant sounds from the valley below, the usual. But as I stood there, waiting for the compass to settle, I noticed the wind had dropped. Not gradually, just gone. The air felt still. I looked up from the compass. The horizon stretched out ahead, a low line of hills fading into the distance. The sky above it was clear, no clouds, just that dimming light. I looked back down at the compass. The needle had stopped moving, but it wasn't pointing north. It sat slightly off, angled maybe 10 degrees to the right. I turned slowly, trying to align myself with it. The needle didn't correct. It stayed fixed in that wrong position. I felt that quiet tension settle in. Not fear, just something not lining up. I slipped the compass back into my pocket and looked around. The ridge felt quieter than it should have. Not silent, but muted. The distant sounds from the valley were gone. Even my own movement felt softer, like it wasn't carrying as far. I shifted my footing. Loose stones crunched under my boots, but the sound felt dull. I glanced back the way I'd come. The trail was still there, cutting back along the ridge. Nothing out of place. I turned forward again. That's when I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light, a faint glow just above the horizon. Barely visible. I narrowed my eyes. The glow wasn't spreading. It wasn't like the last light of the day. It was contained. A small, soft patch hovering just above the line of the hills. I stood still, watching it. It didn't move, didn't change position. Just sat there. Then it pulsed. Once. Slow. The brightness increased slightly, then dropped back down. At the same time, I felt a pressure in my ears, sharp, like when you descend too quickly. I swallowed, it didn't clear. I took a step back. The pressure eased slightly. I stopped, looked at the glow again. It was still there, unchanged. I took another step forward. The pressure came back, stronger. I froze in place, watching. The glow didn't pulse again, it just sat there, faint and steady. I tried to focus on it. The moment I did, it seemed to blur slightly, like it slipped just out of clarity. I blinked, looked slightly to the side. It became more defined again. That made me uneasy in a way I couldn't quite explain. I checked my phone. No signal. That wasn't unusual up there, but it stood out. I looked at the time. It didn't match what I expected. I was sure I'd only stopped for a minute or two. The phone said nearly 10 minutes had passed. I frowned, trying to piece it together. Then I looked back up. The glow pulsed again. Once, same as before. A slow increase in brightness, then back down. The pressure in my ears peaked again. Stronger this time. I winced slightly. Then it stopped. The pressure dropped. The glow vanished. Not faded, not moved, just gone. The horizon looked normal again, just a dark line against the dim sky. I stood there for a few seconds, waiting. Nothing came back. The wind picked up again. Light at first, then steady. The distant sounds returned. Faint, but there. I reached for the compass again, pulled it out, held it flat. The needle snapped into place instantly, pointing north, exactly where it should. I turned slowly, checking it against the landscape. Everything lined up. Normal. I looked back at the horizon. Nothing unusual, no glow, no movement, just the fading light. I stood there a moment longer, then started walking again. The rest of the hike down felt normal. The sounds were right, the air felt right, but every now and then I'd glance back toward that part of the horizon. Half expecting to see that glow again, it never came back. But the way the compass had stopped, not spinning, not broken, just fixed in the wrong direction, felt like it had been pointing at something that wasn't there anymore. The power went out while I was rinsing a mug. 1 second the kitchen light was on, the kettle humming, everything normal. Then it all dropped at once. No flicker, no warning. Just dark. The kind of dark where the house suddenly feels bigger than it is. I stood there for a second with my hands still under the tap, listening. Nothing. No fridge, no clock, no background hum. Just silence. I turned the tap off and wiped my hands on a towel, then grabbed my phone from the counter and turned the flashlight on. The beam felt too sharp in the dark. I walked into the living room and looked out the front window. The whole street was out. No porch lights, no street lights, nothing from the houses across the road. Just faint outlines and a dull, gray sky above. That part wasn't unusual. We get outages sometimes, but the sky looked wrong, not completely dark. There were clouds, low, heavy, but they weren't catching light from anywhere. No orange glow from town, no reflection from anything. They just hung there. I stood there for a minute, waiting for something to come back on. Nothing did. I checked my phone, no signal. That part I noticed immediately. Even during outages, I usually get at least something. I moved the phone around a bit, but it didn't change. I went to the front door and opened it. Cold air came in, still. No wind. I stepped outside onto the driveway. The quiet felt thicker out there, like the whole area had been muted. I looked up again. That's when I noticed the glow. It wasn't obvious at first, just a faint change in the clouds above the houses. A patch that looked slightly lighter than the rest. Not bright, just different. I took a few steps forward, trying to get a better angle. The glow wasn't coming from the ground. It was inside the clouds. Like something behind them was lighting them from within. I frowned, trying to figure out what it could be. There weren't any planes, no lightning, no flashes, just that steady, dim light. I stood there, watching. After a few seconds, I realized it wasn't staying the same. It was shifting, not moving across the sky, changing shape, like the light source behind the clouds was moving slowly, adjusting. The edges of the glowing patch weren't stable. They expanded slightly, then pulled back. I held still, watching. The rest of the sky stayed dark. Only that one area had the glow. I checked my phone again, still no signal. I looked back up. The glow seemed a little brighter now, not by much, just enough that I could see more of the cloud texture within it. There were faint variations, darker and lighter areas moving slowly, not like wind, more like something was passing behind them. I swallowed and glanced around the street. Still no one else outside. No doors opening, no voices, just me. I stepped further out into the road. The glow stayed in the same part of the sky, not following me, not reacting, just there. I listened. There was a sound, or something close to it, not something I could hear clearly. More like a pressure, a low, steady presence that felt like it was in the air rather than coming from a direction. I rubbed my ears slightly. The feeling didn't change. I looked back up. The glow shifted again, this time more noticeably. The brighter part moved slightly to the left, still within the clouds. The rest of the sky remained unchanged. I stood there for what felt like a long time, watching, trying to understand what I was seeing. Then the glow started to fade, slowly, not abruptly, like someone was lowering the intensity. The bright patch softened, the edges blurred. The variations within it became less defined. I took a step back toward the driveway. The pressure in the air seemed to ease slightly. The glow continued to dim. Within a few seconds, it was barely noticeable. Then it was gone. The clouds looked like normal clouds again. Dark, flat. I stood there staring at the sky, waiting for it to come back. It didn't. And then, just as suddenly, the power came back. Streetlights flicked on, porch lights lit up. I heard appliances in my house start up again. The normal background noise returned. It felt almost too loud after the silence. I blinked, looking around. Everything looked normal again. I checked my phone. Signal was back. Full bars. I looked at the time. It didn't match. It said 9:18. I was sure the outage had happened just after 9. It felt like maybe a few minutes, not nearly 20. I stood there for a bit longer, looking up at the sky. Nothing unusual. No glow, no movement. Just clouds lit faintly now by the streetlights and distant town glow. I went back inside and shut the door. The house felt normal again, warm, familiar, but that moment stuck with me. The way the light had been inside the clouds, not reflecting, not shining through, just there, and how it faded right before everything else came back. I only noticed it because of the timestamp jump. I wasn't even looking for anything unusual. I just check my camera footage every now and then out of habit. The camera covers my backyard, nothing special, just a cheap setup after someone tried opening the shed a few months back. It was late afternoon when I checked it, scrolling through the previous night. Everything looked normal at first. The usual stuff, wind moving the branches, a cat cutting across the fence at around 1:12 a.m., nothing out of place. Then I hit 2:38. The footage froze for a split second. Not a full stop, just a slight stutter. Then the entire screen went white. Not bright like a light turning on. Completely washed out. No shapes, no shadows, just white. I paused it. The timestamp read 2:30 a.m. I stepped frame by frame. The image before it was normal. Dark yard, faint outlines of the fence and the tree. Then white. The next frame I could access was 2:38:24. 7 seconds missing. The image snapped back to normal like nothing had happened. No fade, no transition. Just normal again. I sat there for a minute staring at it. I replayed it, same thing. Normal, white, normal. With that gap in between, I checked the rest of the footage. Everything before and after was fine. No glitches, no other skips. Just that one moment. I leaned back in my chair, trying to think of what could cause that. Maybe a light, a car pulling in nearby with headlights hitting the camera. But even then, you'd see some kind of shape, some direction to the light. This was just blank. I got up and went to the back door, looked out at the yard. Everything looked normal. Fence, tree, shed, no signs of anything unusual. I went back to the footage and watched it again, slowed it down, frame by frame. The white wasn't uniform in the way a normal overexposure would be. There were slight variations, faint shapes, but they didn't make sense, like the image had been stretched or distorted underneath the brightness. I zoomed in on one of the frames. The pixels broke apart, but the effect stayed. Something was there, not visible in a way I could define. Just not empty. I checked the camera settings. No motion alerts had triggered, no notifications. It hadn't registered anything. I checked the system logs. The camera had been recording continuously, no downtime, no errors, just that gap. I left it alone for a few hours after that, tried not to think about it, but it kept bothering me. Around 9 that night, I went outside, stood in the yard, looked at it from the same angle as the camera. The sky was clear, no clouds, no planes passing overhead. I looked at the tree. The branches were still, no wind. I stood there for a minute, trying to imagine what could have caused that kind of flash. Nothing came to mind. I went back inside, checked the footage again, same result. Then I noticed something else. Right before the flash, there was a subtle change, not in the light, in the shadows. The edges of things looked off, like they didn't line up perfectly. I zoomed in. The fence line looked slightly shifted. The tree branches didn't match their usual positions. It was only for a frame. Then the white hit. Then everything returned to normal. I felt that slow, creeping unease settle in. I kept watching. Then I decided to check the live feed. Everything looked normal. Dark yard, same as always. I left it open on my phone and sat there. Nothing happened. After a while, I put the phone down and went to make something to eat. When I came back, I glanced at the screen. For a second, I thought I saw it again. A flicker. Not full white, just a quick brightening. I picked up the phone immediately. The feed looked normal, no sign of anything. I checked the recorded footage for that moment. Nothing. No skip, no flash, just normal video. I sat there for a bit, staring at it. Then I noticed the time. It didn't match. I was sure I'd been in the kitchen for maybe 5 minutes. The clock said it had been closer to 15. I went back to the backyard again. Opened the door slowly. The air felt colder than before. Still. Quiet. I stepped outside, looked up. Nothing. Just the dark sky. I walked a few steps into the yard, turned around to look at the house. The camera was mounted above the door, angled down. I tried to picture what it would see. Then I noticed something. The ground beneath it looked slightly brighter, not illuminated. Just off. Like the darkness there wasn't as deep as it should have been. I stepped closer. The feeling changed, subtle, like walking into a different pocket of air. I stopped, listened. Nothing. No sound at all. I looked back at the camera. For a second, I had this strong feeling that it wasn't just recording, that something had passed through that space, something the camera couldn't handle properly. I stepped back. The feeling eased. The yard looked normal again. I went back inside and shut the door. Checked the footage one more time before going to bed. That white flash was still there. The gap's still there. Nothing else changed. Later that night, I woke up for no clear reason. Checked my phone, 3:02 a.m. I opened the camera app. The live feed showed the yard. Normal. Still, but I noticed something at the very edge of the frame, near where the white flash had happened. The image looked slightly distorted, just a small area, like the pixels weren't lining up right. I stared at it for a few seconds. Then it snapped back to normal. I didn't go outside again. I just locked the phone and stayed in bed. The next morning, I checked the footage from that time. No distortion, no glitch, just the usual empty yard. But the gap from the night before was still there. 7 seconds, completely missing. And whatever caused it didn't leave anything behind the camera could actually show. I noticed it because the field stayed dark. I was driving back from visiting my cousin out near Ely, taking one of those narrow farm roads that cut between open fields for miles. It was late, just after midnight, and there wasn't a single car out there. No houses close to the road either, just hedgerows and flat land on both sides. The sky was clear, but there was no moon, so it was darker than usual. My headlights were doing most of the work. I'd been driving for maybe 20 minutes without seeing anything but the road ahead and the occasional reflective marker. That's when I saw the glow. At first, I thought it was a farmhouse light in the distance. It was low, sitting just above the fields on the right side. Soft, pale, not bright enough to be a floodlight or anything like that. I kept driving. Something about it didn't sit right. I glanced back at the road, then at the glow again. It hadn't changed. Still hovering in the same spot, maybe a couple feet above the ground. The thing that got me was the field around it. There was no light spilling onto the grass, no reflection. The ground stayed completely dark, even though the glow was clearly there. I slowed down. My headlights swept a bit further across the field as I eased forward, but they didn't interact with it either. The glow stayed separate, like it wasn't part of the same space. I pulled over slightly, just enough to stop safely on the side of the road. Engine still running, I leaned forward, trying to get a better look. The glow was maybe 50 or 60 meters out, still low, still not lighting anything around it. I cracked the window a bit. No sound, no insects, no wind, just silence. That's when I felt it. A faint pressure in my ears. I swallowed, expecting it to clear. It didn't. I kept my eyes on the glow. It didn't flicker, didn't pulse, just stayed steady. I reached up and turned off my headlights. The road went dark instantly, but the glow didn't change. If anything, it became more noticeable. Still not illuminating the ground, still just there. I felt that tension in my chest start to build. I watched it for a few seconds, then it moved, not sideways, not forward or back, up, straight up, no acceleration, no build-up. It just lifted, smooth, silent, like it had been pulled upward. I leaned closer to the wheel, watching it. The pressure in my ears increased. I could feel it in my jaw now. The glow rose slowly, maintaining the same shape, the same intensity, still not lighting anything around it. It reached maybe 20 or 30 feet above the ground. Then it paused, just hung there. I held my breath without realizing it. For a second, I thought it might drop back down. Instead, it went higher, faster this time. Still smooth, still silent. Within a few seconds, it was above the height of the hedgerow, then higher than the road. I stepped out of the car without thinking. The moment my feet hit the ground, the pressure in my ears spiked, sharp enough to make me wince. I looked up. The glow was now well above me, and for a second, I thought I saw something around it. Not a solid shape. More like the air around it was slightly distorted, like a faint outline that didn't quite match the sky. Then it shot upward, not fast in the usual sense. There was no visible acceleration. It was just there, and then higher again. In less than a second, it was a small point in the sky, then gone, completely. The pressure in my ears dropped instantly. The silence broke. I could hear wind moving through the fields again, faint but there. A distant car somewhere far off. Everything felt normal again. I stood there for a few seconds, staring at the empty sky. Nothing. No trace of it. I got back into the car and turned the headlights on. The field looked normal. Grass, fence line, nothing unusual. I drove forward slowly, passing the spot where I'd seen the glow. I kept glancing to the right. There was nothing there. No marks, no light, nothing out of place. I pulled over again a bit further down and got out. Walked a few steps toward the field. The ground felt normal under my feet, slightly damp, cold. I looked around trying to find any sign of what I'd just seen. Nothing. I went back to the car. When I got in, I checked the time, 1:37. That didn't make sense. I'd left my cousin's just after 12:30. The drive should have taken about half an hour. Even with stopping, it shouldn't have been that late. I sat there for a minute, trying to figure it out. It didn't add up. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping again. Everything stayed normal. Street lights, other cars, no issues. The next day, I went back out there in the afternoon. Same stretch of road. I found the spot easily. The field looked exactly the same. No discoloration, no damage, just grass. But when I stood at the edge of the road and looked out across it, something felt off. The distance didn't feel right, like the space where the glow had been was slightly deeper than the rest. Hard to explain. I stepped forward a bit. It went away. Stepped back. It came back, not strong. Just enough to notice if you were paying attention. I stood there for a while, looking at that same spot. Nothing happened. No light, no movement. But every now and then, I had the feeling that if I stayed there long enough, something would appear again. Not in the same place, but close enough that I'd recognize it. I woke up already holding my phone. That was the first thing that felt wrong. My hand was wrapped around it like I'd been using it right before falling asleep, but I don't fall asleep like that. I always put it on the nightstand. The screen was on. Dim, but still lit. And warm. Not just slightly warm from being under a blanket. It felt like it had been running for a while. I blinked a couple times, trying to clear my head. The room was still dark. Curtains closed. No light coming in from outside. Just that faint glow from the phone. I lifted it slightly, squinting at the screen. The camera app was open. Rear camera. Pointed toward the window. That's when I sat up. I didn't remember opening the camera. Didn't remember picking the phone up at all. I checked the time, 2:41. I'd gone to bed around midnight. I remembered scrolling for a bit, then putting the phone down. No reason I'd be awake now. I looked back at the camera feed. The image was dark, but I could make out the outline of the window and the curtains. There was a faint light beyond them. Not strong enough to illuminate the room, just enough that the camera picked it up as a dull, gray-blue shape. I held the phone steady, staring at it. The light outside didn't look like a street light. Wrong color, and it didn't move. I lowered the phone slightly and looked at the actual window. Still dark. No visible light through the curtains. I raised the phone again. The light was still there on the screen. Same position, same faint glow. That didn't make sense. I shifted my angle slightly, tilting the phone. The image adjusted like it should. The light stayed fixed outside. I stood up slowly, still holding the phone, and walked toward the window. The floor felt cold under my feet. The air in the room felt still, like nothing was moving. I stopped about a foot from the window. The camera feed showed the light more clearly now. It wasn't a single point, more like a soft patch hovering just beyond the glass, no clear edges. Just there. I reached out with my free hand and pulled the curtain back slightly. The moment I did, the phone vibrated. A short, low buzz. I froze. The camera image flickered for a split second, then stabilized. The light was still there. I looked past the curtain. Nothing. Just darkness, no glow, no source. I moved the curtain a bit more. Still nothing outside. But on the phone screen, the light remained. Exactly where it had been. My ears started to feel strange, a slight pressure building. I swallowed, but it didn't clear. I stepped back from the window. The phone stayed pointed toward it. The light didn't change. I lowered the phone and turned it slightly away from the window. The light disappeared from the screen immediately. I turned it back. It reappeared. Same position, same faint glow. My chest tightened a bit. I took another step back. The pressure in my ears increased. I could feel it in my jaw now. The phone vibrated again. Longer this time. I almost dropped it. The camera image flickered again, but this time it distorted. For a split second, the light stretched, not outward, but vertically, like it had depth. Then it snapped back to normal. I stood there, not moving. The phone felt heavier in my hand. Warmer. I checked the time again. Still 2:41. The seconds weren't moving. I stared at it. The numbers stayed frozen. I looked back at the camera feed. The light pulsed. Very faint. Just a slight increase in brightness, then back to normal. And for a moment, I thought I saw something behind it. Not a shape. More like a shadow moving through it. I blinked. The effect was gone. The phone vibrated again. This time I felt it through my whole hand. A deeper buzz, almost like it was resonating. The pressure in my ears peaked, sharp enough to make me wince. I turned away from the window quickly. The moment I did, the vibration stopped. The pressure dropped. I looked back at the phone. The camera app was still open, but the light was gone. Just a dark image of the curtains. The time ticked forward. 2:42. I stood there for a second, breathing slowly. Everything felt normal again. The air moved slightly. I could hear faint sounds from outside. I turned back to the window and pulled the curtain open fully. Nothing. Just the street outside. Dark, empty. No lights. I went back to bed, still holding the phone. I didn't remember putting it down, but I must have, because the next thing I remember was waking up to my alarm. Morning light coming through the curtains. Everything normal. I sat up and grabbed my phone. Battery was low, lower than it should have been. I checked the camera roll. There were videos, several of them, all recorded between 2:39 and 2:41. I opened the first one. It showed the same view as before, the window, the curtains, dark. Then the image flickered. The light appeared, faint, hovering beyond the glass. The video stuttered, frames dropped, then it cut to static for a second before ending. I opened another, same thing. But in this one, for a brief moment, the distortion was clearer. The light stretched vertically again, and behind it, something moved. Not defined. Just a darker shift within the glow. I scrubbed through the rest. All similar. Short clips, corrupted frames, that same faint light. In the last video, right before it ended, the camera angle changed slightly, as if the phone had tilted. The light moved closer to the center of the frame, and for a single frame, just one, the distortion cleared. The light wasn't just outside the window, it was right up against the glass, almost touching it. Then the video ended. I checked the phone settings, no timers, no scheduled recordings, nothing that would explain it. I went to the window and looked at the glass, clean, no marks, no condensation, nothing. I stood there for a while, trying to piece it together, but the only thing I couldn't explain was how the phone ended up in my hand. Pointed at the window, already recording, before I woke up. I noticed it because the pattern didn't match anymore. I was lying on my back in the garden, just outside my sister's place in Northumberland. She lives far enough out that you actually get a proper sky at night, not the washed out version you see in town. It was cold, clear, and still. No wind, no clouds. The kind of night where the stars feel close. I'd been out there maybe 20 minutes, just staring up, letting my eyes adjust. You start picking out the same shapes after a while, even if you don't know the names. There was this small cluster slightly above and to the right of where I was looking. Nothing special about it. Just a tight grouping, easy to recognize. I'd been glancing back to it every so often without really thinking about it. Then, at one point, it didn't look right. I frowned slightly, trying to place what had changed. It wasn't obvious at first. The stars were still there. Same brightness, same number. But the spacing felt off, like one of them had shifted slightly. I stared at it, trying to line it up with how I remembered it. Then it happened again. Not a star moving on its own. The whole cluster shifted, just slightly, like something had passed behind them, nudging their positions. It wasn't fast, more like a subtle slide. Then it stopped. I sat up a little, propping myself on my elbows. The rest of the sky was still. Only that cluster had changed. I blinked a couple times. The stars returned to their original positions, exactly where they'd been before. Like nothing had happened. I lay back again, trying to stay still. Focused on that same area. For a few seconds, everything looked normal. Then I felt it. A slight pressure in my ears. Not painful, just enough to notice. I swallowed. It didn't clear. I kept my eyes fixed on the cluster. It stayed steady. Then, again, it shifted. Same movement. A slight drift. All the stars in that small group moving together, just a fraction. Like something unseen had passed through them. I felt my chest tighten. I sat up properly this time. The pressure in my ears increased slightly. I could feel it in my jaw. I didn't take my eyes off the sky. The cluster held its new position for a second. Then it snapped back. Instantly. No transition, just back to normal. I looked around at the rest of the sky. Everything else was unchanged. Stars steady, no movement, no light, nothing. I looked back at the cluster. Still normal. I stayed there, watching it. After a few seconds, I noticed something else. The air had gone completely still. Not just calm. Still. No movement at all. The usual distant sounds had dropped out too. No cars, no wind, nothing, just silence. I shifted slightly on the ground. The sound of my jacket against the grass felt too loud, too isolated. I looked back at the cluster. This time, when it shifted, I saw something with it, not clearly. More like the space around the stars distorted, like a faint ripple. It moved through the cluster, and as it did, the stars shifted again, then returned. I held my breath without realizing it. The pressure in my ears increased, sharper now. I swallowed hard. It didn't go away. I tried to focus on the ripple, but it wasn't consistent. It appeared for a second, then gone, then there again. Each time the stars moved slightly, then snapped back. I felt that tightness in my chest build. I pushed myself up to a sitting position. The moment I did, the cluster stopped moving, completely. Everything looked normal again. The pressure in my ears eased slightly. I stayed still, watching. Nothing happened. Then, slowly, the stars in that cluster dimmed. Not all of them, just slightly, like they were further away. The rest of the sky stayed the same, only that small group. I leaned forward slightly. The pressure returned. The stars brightened again, back to normal. I leaned back. They dimmed slightly. I froze, didn't move. The stars held steady. The pressure in my ears peaked, sharp enough to make me wince. And then it stopped, all at once. The pressure dropped. The silence broke. I could hear the faint rustle of trees again. A distant car somewhere far off. Normal sounds. The cluster stayed still. No more shifting, no dimming. Just normal. I sat there for a minute, staring at it. Nothing else happened. I lay back down slowly. Kept watching. Everything stayed the same. Eventually, I went back inside. Checked the time on my phone, 12:58. That didn't make sense. I'd gone out just after 11:30. There was no way it had been that long. I stood there in the kitchen for a bit, trying to work it out. It didn't add up. The next night, I went back out again. Same spot, same time, looked at the same part of the sky. The cluster was there, exactly where it should be. I watched it for almost an hour. Nothing happened, but every now and then when I blinked, there was a moment where it looked slightly off, like the spacing wasn't quite right. Then it would snap back, and I couldn't tell if it had actually moved or if I was just expecting it to. I was driving back from a late shift, maybe just after 2 a.m., on this long stretch of road that cuts through open farmland. No houses for miles, just fields on both sides and the occasional gate or tractor track. It had been raining earlier, not heavy, but enough to leave everything damp. The road still had that dark, reflective sheen to it, and every now and then I'd hit shallow patches of water that made a soft hiss under the tires. I had the heater on low, radio barely audible, just enough to fill the silence. I remember feeling tired, but not dangerously so. Just ready to be home. The sky was clear by then. No clouds, just a few stars visible between patches of thin haze. It wasn't pitch black, but there wasn't much light either. My headlights were doing most of the work. About 10 minutes into that stretch, I noticed something odd, but I didn't react to it right away. It was just a reflection. At first, I thought it was water droplets on the inside of the windshield catching the light weirdly. A faint, quick flicker above the beam of the headlights. I blinked a couple of times and adjusted my posture, thinking maybe my eyes were just tired. Then it happened again. A quick glint high above the road, not in front of me exactly, more like above the point where the headlights reached, somewhere in the air where there shouldn't have been anything to reflect off. I slowed down slightly and leaned forward, trying to see better. The road ahead was empty, no signs, no overhead cables, no branches hanging over. It's a really open stretch, flat land, nothing tall enough to be above the road like that. I drove another few seconds, watching. Nothing. Then it flashed again. This time I caught it properly. A small, sharp reflection, like light hitting metal. Not a soft glow, more like a quick, clean glint, the kind you get off a polished surface, and it wasn't stationary. It shifted slightly, just a small tilt, like something adjusting its angle. I instinctively slowed down more, maybe down to 30. My headlights stayed fixed on the road, but whatever that thing was, it kept catching the light at the edge of the beam. I couldn't see the object itself clearly, just the reflections. But I could tell it was up there, higher than a sign would be. Higher than anything I'd normally expect on that road. I rolled the window down a bit, even though it was cold, just to listen. Nothing. No drone noise, no wind movement, nothing mechanical, just the faint sound of the car and the tires on wet pavement. I kept driving, eyes flicking between the road and that spot above. The reflection happened again, but longer this time. And for a second I could make out a shape. It wasn't detailed, more like an outline against the darker sky. Something smooth, slightly curved. It didn't look like a drone. Too big, and it wasn't blinking or making any noise. It didn't look like a bird either. It wasn't moving like one. It just hung there. Then it tilted. I don't know how else to describe it. It was like the entire shape rotated slightly, just enough for my headlights to catch it fully for a split second. It looked metallic, not shiny like chrome, more like brushed metal. Dull, but still reflective. The shape was wrong, though. Not a perfect circle, not square. Kind of stretched, like an oval but flattened in places. Smooth edges, no visible parts or seams. And then it moved. Not gradually. It didn't drift or glide. It shot straight upward. No build-up, no acceleration I could track. 1 second it was there, the next it was just gone. Straight up into the sky. I actually flinched, like my body reacted before my brain did. I hit the brakes harder than I meant to and slowed down almost to a stop in the middle of the road. I just sat there, staring up through the windshield. Nothing, just empty sky. No trail, no sound, no sign anything had been there at all. My heart was racing more than it should have been for what I'd just seen. I told myself it had to be something normal. A drone maybe, even though I hadn't heard anything, or some kind of reflection from something else that I'd misjudged. But the way it moved didn't match anything I knew. I stayed there for maybe 30 seconds, engine idling, trying to see if it would come back. It didn't. Eventually, I started driving again, slower this time. I kept checking the sky, even though I knew I probably wouldn't see it again. The road felt different after that. Not physically, just off, like the space around me was bigger than it should have been. Every now and then I thought I saw another flicker, but when I focused on it, there was nothing there. A couple of minutes later, something else happened. My radio cut out, not completely. It didn't switch off, but the sound dropped into static, like I'd driven out of range. That's not unusual in some areas, but I'd never had it happen on that stretch before. I reached over and adjusted the dial slightly, thinking maybe it was just a weak signal. For a second, the music came back. Then it warped. Not distorted like bad reception, but slowed down slightly, like the pitch dropped for half a second before snapping back. Then it went to static again. I turned it off. The silence felt heavier than before. I checked my mirrors. Still nothing behind me. No cars, no lights, just the dark road stretching back into nothing. I kept driving, trying to focus on the lines and not think about what I'd seen. Then I noticed the time. I'd glanced at it maybe 5 minutes before all that happened. But now, according to the clock on my dashboard, nearly 20 minutes had passed. That didn't line up. I hadn't stopped that long. Even sitting there after it shot upward, it couldn't have been more than a minute. I tried to think if I'd zoned out or something, but I didn't remember losing focus or drifting. The road ahead looked the same as it always did. Same landmarks, same turns, but the timing didn't match. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. Nothing else happened. No more reflections, no sounds, nothing unusual. When I pulled into my driveway, I sat there for a bit before getting out. I checked the sky one more time. Clear. Still. Empty. The next day, I drove that same road in the afternoon. Bright daylight. There's nothing above it. No cables, no structures, nothing tall enough to be where that thing had been, just open sky. I even pulled over at the spot where I thought I'd seen it and stood outside the car, looking up. It felt normal. But I kept thinking about that reflection, the way it only showed when the angle was right, like it was just outside what I was supposed to see, and how it didn't move like anything I recognized, just tilted once, then gone. I was up late one night, just like I usually am when I'm trying to get some photos of the stars. I've always been into amateur astronomy and night photography, so it's not unusual for me to be outside with my camera around midnight or later. This particular night, the sky was clear, really clear, and the stars looked perfect, so I set up my tripod in the backyard and started snapping away. Between midnight and about 2 in the morning, I took a bunch of pictures, just pointing the camera straight up or at different parts of the sky. It was the kind of calm, quiet night where the only sounds were a few distant cars and some rustling leaves. I felt completely alone out there, but in a good way. I like that kind of solitude. The next day, I loaded the photos onto my computer to check them out. Most looked exactly like you'd expect. Sharp stars, some constellations, a few satellites caught as tiny lines of light moving across the frame. But then I noticed something odd. In every photo taken between midnight and 2, there was this blurred triangular shape. It wasn't a sharp outline or a clear object, more like a smudge or a faint shadow, always somewhere near the center or just off to one side. It didn't move or change shape much, just there in every single shot. The color was strange too, sort of a dull gray with a faint glow around the edges, but nothing that looked like a lens flare or any typical camera artifact I've seen before. At first, I figured it had to be some kind of camera issue, maybe a dirty lens or a sensor problem. So I cleaned everything carefully, checked my settings, even took some test shots around sunset and during the day. No triangular shapes, just normal pictures. The night after, I set the camera up again, trying to catch the same part of the sky. I took photos at the same intervals between midnight and 2. When I looked at those pictures the next day, there it was again. The same blurry triangle, same size and shape in roughly the same spot. I started paying closer attention that night while I was outside. At first, I thought maybe I was imagining things, but the feeling of being watched crept in slowly. Nothing obvious, no one standing in the shadows or anything, but the air got heavy in the backyard, like something was hovering just out of sight. I noticed the neighborhood was unusually quiet. No barking dogs, no distant traffic noises, just a strange, almost unnatural stillness. I glanced around a few times, but didn't see anyone. My phone was on silent, so no distractions, just the occasional click of the camera shutter and the low hum of my laptop inside. Then I started hearing it. A faint mechanical clicking sound. Not loud, more like something buried deep in the background noise of the night, but definitely there. It was steady, rhythmic, almost like a clock ticking, but more metallic. I tried to locate it, but it didn't get any closer or farther. It just stayed, steady and low. The clicking lasted for maybe 15 minutes. I told myself it was probably just something normal, a machine somewhere, maybe a generator in a neighbor's yard or a distant radio tower. But still, it didn't quite fit with how quiet everything else was. After a while, I put the camera down and went inside. I checked the photos again on my computer, just to make sure the triangle was still showing up. It was, in every shot from that time window. On the third night, I decided to bring my binoculars out with me and just watch the sky for a while, without the camera. The triangle shape wasn't visible to the naked eye or through the binoculars. The stars were perfectly normal. No blinking lights, no moving shapes, nothing unusual. Still, I kept feeling like something was nearby, just out of reach, like an invisible presence hanging above the treetops, watching quietly. When I got back inside, I noticed something else weird. My phone had a few new notifications, messages from people I didn't know. Just random numbers, and the messages were strange. A few symbols I didn't recognize, like scrambled letters or code, nothing readable. I deleted them, thinking it was spam, but then one more came in. This one was different. It was an audio file, no text, just a short clip. I listened to it. At first, there was static, then the same faint clicking sound I'd heard outside. Then, very quietly, a whisper. It was my own voice. But the word it said was something I didn't know, something that didn't make sense. It wasn't any language I recognized, just a soft, breathy syllable. I checked my phone logs to see if I'd called or recorded anything at that time. Nothing. I hadn't spoken to anyone in hours, hadn't used any apps that could have recorded sound. I started wondering if I was losing track of time or dreaming while awake, but nothing else felt off. My memory of the night was clear, except for some brief moments where I couldn't say what I was doing. The next day, I went back through the photos, the messages, the sound clip, trying to connect dots. The triangle shape on the pictures, the clicking sound, the strange message on my phone, all tied together somehow, but without any clear reason. I thought about showing the photos to a few friends, but I hesitated. I don't know if they'd believe me or just think it was a camera glitch or some prank. After that, the strange messages stopped. The clicking sound didn't come back, and the triangle shape disappeared from my photos. But the feeling stayed, the sense that something was there, watching, just beyond what I could see. I still look up at the stars sometimes, camera ready, hoping to catch it again, but it hasn't shown up since. It happened during my Thursday overnight shift about 3 years ago now. I was running the graveyard block at a small independent station outside Flagstaff. Midnight to 4 a.m., mostly pre-programmed stuff, low audience, very little live interaction. It was an easy gig, especially during the winter when the calls dropped off and the phone lines stayed mostly dead. That night started like any other. I got in around 11:30, checked the queue, queued up the playlists. Weather was clear but cold. I remember scraping frost off my windshield in the parking lot. We ran mostly classic rock and old school alt during the late shift, but I'd sneak in ambient stuff when the manager wasn't checking logs, just to keep myself from nodding off. The call came in a little after 2 a.m. I remember because I just faded out of a long instrumental track and was reaching for my coffee when the line blinked. I hadn't taken a single call all night. I figured it was a trucker or someone killing time, maybe looking for a request. I picked up and did the usual, "You're on the air, what can I play for you?" But there was no voice, just this high-pitched digital tone. Not static, not feedback. A weird, clean note, like something you'd hear from a modem if you're old enough to remember dial-up. I said hello again. Still nothing. Then the tone changed, dropped low and mechanical, like a deep hum with layers under it. Chirps clicking like automated signals or compressed data. It wasn't random either. It shifted in pulses, kind of rhythmic, but not in any pattern I could place. I took it off air and kept listening, just in case it was a prank. But it didn't sound like someone screwing around. It sounded too deliberate. Then, after maybe 30 seconds, the signal just stopped. Not a click or hang up, just gone. Deadline. I figured I'd toss on another track and think it through, but when I looked back at the console, all the meters were frozen. Dead air. No signal to the tower. I hadn't touched anything except the phone. I tried resetting the stream, then the automation software. Nothing worked. The mic channel was still hot, but the board wasn't feeding anything to the transmitter. Even my monitor feed had gone silent. I called our tech guy, first time I'd ever had to wake him during my shift. He didn't pick up, so I left a message and started rebooting the hardware manually. Took everything down, waited, brought it back up in stages. The signal came back eventually, around 6 or 7 minutes later, but that window of dead air, it was total. No static, just black silence. I checked the logs. Nothing registered during that time. The system showed continuous play as if the playlist had kept going, but no audio reached the board. And the weird part, the last song before the call, the one I remember fading out of, was still queued like it had never actually played. I went back to the recording archive. We had a digital logger that saved the entire broadcast in 5-hour blocks. I pulled the file for that night, jumped to just before the call. The file played fine. My voice came through introducing the track. I said the station ID. Everything was normal. Then came the point where I picked up the phone, and then nothing. Just total silence for the next 6 minutes. No tones, no hum, not even my voice. It was like the mic had cut out the moment I answered. The waveform was flat. I skipped ahead and the audio returned mid-track like nothing had happened. That was the part that really got under my skin. It wasn't that something strange happened live that could be chalked up to a glitch or interference or whatever, but it was gone from the log too, like it never existed. Like my side of the interaction had been erased. I checked the incoming call list. We used a basic caller ID system that time-stamped every ring. The screen showed a call at 2:11 a.m., number withheld. Duration, 47 seconds. I called it back. Got a fast, busy signal. The kind you hear when a line's been disconnected. I didn't talk about it the next day. I wrote up a generic note about a system hang and submitted it to the tech crew, but I didn't mention the tones or the signal drop. The manager didn't say anything, probably didn't even notice the gap. The rest of the week went normal, though I kept one eye on the phone console every night. Nothing else like that happened. Until the following Thursday. 2:08 a.m., the phone rang again. Same withheld number. I froze for a second, then answered without putting it on air. Same tone. High and steady at first, then it dropped into the layered mechanical hum. Almost identical to the first call, but this time it only lasted about 20 seconds. Then a click. An actual click. This time, and a voice. I don't know how else to say this, but it didn't sound human. Not robotic either. Just wrong. Like someone speaking through a filter they didn't fully understand. Words slurred into tones, clipped mid-syllable, no inflection. It said something like inbound, or at least that's what it sounded like, but with a weird delay between the syllables. Inbound. Then silence again. No broadcast cut this time. Everything stayed live. But my mic wasn't working for about a minute afterward. No one noticed, or at least no one called about it. I kept the music going and didn't take any more calls. I stayed in the booth until sunrise. I never got another call like that again. I kept watching the logs, kept recording backups of every shift. Nothing showed up. No more dropped signals. No more silence. Just that 1 week. 2 calls. Sometimes I wonder if it was some shortwave freak bouncing signals off the ionosphere or some messed up satellite interference. But I don't buy that. Not with how quiet the line was. Not with the dead air. There's nothing like it in the archives anymore either. I copied the original files to a USB drive, but a few months later when I tried to play them back, the audio had degraded. Just a solid buzz now, like electrical interference, you can't hear anything. But I remember what I heard. I remember the feeling of something pushing into the thing, like it was the signal, like using the broadcast itself, not just piggybacking on it, like it came through the silence. I work for a small weather station just outside Flagstaff, Arizona. Nothing fancy, mostly gathering data from our weather balloons and sending reports to the university and some local agencies. The station is in a pretty remote spot, on a plateau surrounded by forest and desert. Last September, I was on the late afternoon shift, which means prepping the balloons for release just before dusk, then tracking them as they float up through the atmosphere. That day, I was alone at the station except for my dog, Juno. She's a border collie mix, smart as hell, and usually sticks close by. The weather was clear, a bit chilly, with that dry desert air that feels crisp but doesn't bite like snow. The sun was starting to drop low behind the San Francisco peaks, turning the sky orange and purple. I launched the balloon around 6:10 p.m., like I always do. It's one of those big latex ones, filled with helium, with a small package attached beneath it. The camera and some sensors recording temperature, pressure, humidity, and sending it back to us in real time. The balloon floats up slowly, sometimes going as high as 30 kilometers before bursting and falling back. As usual, I switched on the receiver and the monitor showing the camera's live feed. The image was grainy, black and white, but it gave a decent look at what the balloon was passing over. I expected to see the dark outline of the forest and patches of desert moving beneath it as it rose. But then something caught my eye. At about 5,000 meters altitude, roughly 3 kilometers above the ground, there was this dark shape moving alongside the balloon, matching its altitude and speed almost perfectly. At first, I thought it was a bird, maybe a hawk or an eagle, since they sometimes fly high in those parts. But the shape didn't look right. It was too big, too solid looking, and it didn't flap wings or change direction erratically. It just paced the balloon, staying about 200 meters away horizontally, sliding along the same course. I kept watching. Juno sat nearby, eyes fixed on me, probably sensing my distraction. Minutes passed. 10 minutes. 15. The object never veered off. No change in altitude, no speed change. It just glided beside the balloon, moving steadily over the darkening landscape below. I called my supervisor Mark on the radio, told him what I was seeing, and asked if he could check from the other station a few miles east. He said he wasn't getting any signals or anything unusual on their equipment. I thought maybe it was just something that only showed up on the camera feed. At 20 minutes, the object suddenly accelerated straight up. It moved fast, faster than anything I'd seen in the sky around there. The balloon camera's view went fuzzy as the distance grew. The object disappeared into the upper atmosphere in seconds, too quickly to track beyond a certain point. The balloon kept rising until it popped as expected, and I watched the sensors report data all the way to the burst. Nothing else showed up on the feed after the object vanished. That night, back at the station, I downloaded all the footage and data. When I replayed the video on my laptop, the object was there, pacing right alongside the balloon, clearly visible as a dark oval shape against the sky. No wings, no lights, just moving smoothly. But the weird thing is, the GPS data from the balloon didn't show any disturbances. Nothing on radar scans from nearby stations. I ran the data through every filter and software we have, and nothing explained it. I showed the video to Mark the next day. He shrugged and said maybe it was a rare weather phenomenon, a trick of light or shadow, but neither of us could find a solid explanation. Since then, I've watched every balloon launch closely, hoping to catch something similar. Nothing. Just the usual slow rise, pop, and data dump. Sometimes I think about how precise that thing was, matching the balloon's altitude and speed for so long without making a sound or a visible signature beyond what the camera caught, and how suddenly it shot straight up, faster than anything I've ever seen. Juno still likes to follow me out to the launch site, especially at dusk. She stares into the sky more than usual, like she remembers something I don't. I keep the footage saved, but I don't show it around. Most people at the station think I'm nuts when I mention it, and honestly, I'm not sure what I saw either. I was out in the backfield one afternoon putting in new fence posts. The old fence had seen better days. Posts rotted, wire sagging, and after the winter storms, a few sections had just fallen apart. I figured a weekend of work and I'd have it all fixed up again. I'd started early, and by mid-afternoon, I'd cleared the overgrown brush and pulled out the worst of the old posts. I was getting ready to dig holes for the new ones when I noticed something that made me stop. The old posts that were still standing, they weren't just leaning or broken like I expected. They were bent outward, away from the center of this patch of the field, in a near-perfect arc. First, I thought maybe a big animal had knocked them down or something, but the bend was too smooth, too consistent. The curve was like someone had pushed them out from inside all at once. The circle the posts formed was about 25 to 30 feet across. The ground inside was just grass, nothing unusual. No footprints, no disturbed earth. I scratched my head and walked around trying to figure out what had caused it. There was no sign of a storm or flood damage there, and the rest of the field looked untouched. I figured I must have missed something the last time I looked at this fence, but I'd been out here just a few weeks earlier, and the posts had been standing straight, even if a little weathered. I walked the perimeter of the circle slowly. The posts curved outward like a dome had pushed against them from inside, but I couldn't find anything inside the ring. No holes, no weird markings, just that strange bending. It felt off, like the field had shifted, but only in that exact spot. I told my wife about it that evening, but she just said maybe it was old machinery or some kind of farming equipment I'd forgotten about. I thought about that, but the bend was too smooth and all the same direction. Machines tend to smash or break things unevenly, not bend everything like a bow. The next morning, I came back out to the circle early just to look at it in daylight. The air was still cool and the field smelled like wet earth and grass. When I got there, the posts looked the same, but the light made the bending more obvious. The wood was splintered in places, but there was no fresh damage, just old, weathered cracks. As I stood there, I started hearing this low hum. It wasn't loud, more like a vibration under the ground. I figured it was a tractor or some kind of machinery from a neighbor's farm, so I looked around. The nearest farm was a good distance away, and I couldn't see or hear anything moving. The hum faded after a few seconds. I went to the circle again the following night, just after sunset. I don't know why. I guess I wanted to see if the circle looked different in the dark or if anything else was going on. I brought a flashlight, but I didn't really expect to find anything. That night, the posts looked darker, the bends casting long shadows in the beam from my flashlight. I felt kind of exposed out there, but the field was quiet. Then something caught my eye. A faint glow coming from inside the circle, just beyond the bent posts. It wasn't bright, more like a soft, pale light hovering just above the grass. I froze and watched for a minute. The glow stayed in one spot, flickering slightly, but didn't grow or move toward me. It didn't seem like any kind of fire or flashlight, just light. I didn't hear any sounds from it, just that same low hum I'd heard before. I wanted to call out or get closer, but something made me hold back. I kept my distance, shining my flashlight around the circle, but there was nothing else there. Then the light disappeared slowly, like someone turned it off. I left the field that night with an uneasy feeling I can't really explain. When I got home, I checked my phone. No missed calls, no messages, but my battery was down more than I remembered. It felt like the signal was weaker than usual, too. The next day, I talked to a couple of neighbors, but no one else had seen or heard anything strange out by the fence. One of them mentioned how the weather had been weird lately, some days hotter than expected, others foggy in the morning, but no real storms or anything that could explain the bent posts. Over the next week, I kept going back to that spot at different times of day. Sometimes I'd hear the hum, sometimes I'd see the faint glow, but it was never consistent. No one else seemed to notice anything, and I started wondering if I was imagining it. One afternoon, while I was repairing a broken section of fence near the circle, I caught the scent of something strange in the air. It wasn't like anything I'd smelled before. Metallic, but not sharp, kind of sweet and faint, like burnt plastic mixed with something earthy. I looked around, but couldn't find a source. The smell lingered just for a moment and then vanished. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept hearing small creaks from outside, like wood flexing or settling, but nothing that made sense, given how calm the night was. I got up a few times and checked the window facing the field. The moonlight made the bent posts look like shadows reaching out. At one point, I thought I saw a shape moving inside the circle, a quick flicker of something just beyond the tree line. When I grabbed my jacket and stepped outside, it was gone. No footprints in the grass, nothing disturbed. A few days later, I noticed that one of the posts on the edge of the circle had shifted a little more. It was bent farther out than before. I didn't touch it. It just felt like whatever had bent those posts was still active somehow. That night, I left a camera set up, pointed at the circle. The next morning, I checked the footage. For hours, nothing happened, but right at 2:58 a.m., the camera picked up a faint glow near the center of the circle. It hovered and pulsed gently, then vanished at 3:05 a.m. I rewound the footage again and again. There was no sound on the recording, just the glow. The camera's internal clock matched the real time perfectly. I told a few friends who work in agriculture or land management, but no one could explain it. Some said it might be the effect of underground gas or something natural, but I doubted it. Nothing about that glow or the bends felt natural. One night, about 2 weeks after I first found the bent posts, I went out again with a flashlight. It was late, probably around midnight. As I walked into the circle, the air seemed heavier, thicker. I swear I could feel eyes on me, like something was watching from just beyond sight. The hum started again, low and steady, and the faint glow appeared near the center of the ring. I stood still, trying to make sense of it, but the feeling of being watched didn't go away. I pulled out my phone to take a picture. The screen flickered and went black. I tried turning it back on, but it wouldn't respond. I put it away and looked up. The glow was gone. I left the field quickly that night, but on the way back to the house, I thought I heard something moving in the bushes beside the road. I stopped and listened. Nothing. Since then, the circle hasn't changed much. The posts stay bent in that same arc, and the glow and hum come and go without pattern. I haven't touched the old fence anymore. Part of me wants to rip it all out and start fresh, but another part doesn't want to disturb it. I don't know what's happening out there. It doesn't seem dangerous, but it feels wrong. Like there's something just beneath the surface of the field, something watching and waiting. I'm still working around it, fixing what I can, but every time I'm near that circle, I feel uneasy, like I'm not alone. Whatever it is, it's there, silent, still, and somehow more than just a bent fence. I noticed the line because it didn't match anything in the room. I was lying on my back, staring at the wall across from my bed. It was late, probably past 2 a.m. I hadn't checked the time in a while, but I couldn't sleep. Just one of those nights where your brain won't shut off. My room faces the backyard. There's a small window with blinds, and usually you get a little bit of streetlight bleeding through from the side, just enough to see shapes. But this wasn't that. This was a thin line, straight, faint, but clearly there. It stretched vertically along the wall, about a foot wide, like a narrow beam of light that had been flattened. At first, I thought maybe a car had turned down the street and the headlights were catching the window at a weird angle. But it wasn't moving the way headlights do. It was too slow. I stayed still, watching it. The line crept sideways across the wall, not jittery, not flickering, just a steady, smooth motion, like it was being dragged across the surface. I pushed myself up slightly on my elbows. The room stayed quiet, no sound of a car passing, no engine, no tires on pavement, nothing, just that line of light moving. It reached the corner where the wall meets the ceiling. Then it continued upward. That's when it started to feel wrong. Light doesn't usually behave like that. If it was coming through the window, it should have stretched and distorted as it climbed. But it didn't. It kept the same shape, same width, same intensity, like it wasn't coming from outside at all. I swung my legs over the side of the bed but didn't stand up yet, just sat there, watching. The line slid onto the ceiling, still straight, still even. It moved slowly across the ceiling now, heading toward the center of the room. I glanced at the window. The blinds hadn't moved, no shifting shadows, no passing light from outside. I looked back at the ceiling. The line was still there, still moving. I stood up this time, slowly, like I didn't want to disturb anything. The floor felt cold under my feet. I took a few steps closer, standing directly under it. The light didn't react, didn't change brightness, didn't flicker. It just kept going. I reached up slightly, not touching it, just holding my hand near where it passed. There was no warmth, no sensation at all. It wasn't like standing in sunlight or under a lamp. It felt like nothing. That made it worse. I pulled my hand back. The line continued moving. It crossed over the center of the ceiling now. Then it started to fade. Not all at once, gradually, like someone was dimming it. The edges softened first, then the brightness dropped. Within a couple seconds, it was gone. The room went back to how it had been before. Dark. Still. I stood there for a moment, staring at the ceiling. waiting for it to come back. Nothing did. I walked over to the window and pulled the blinds up slightly. Outside was quiet. The backyard was dark, no lights, no cars, nothing that could have caused it. I let the blinds fall back into place, turned around, the room looked normal again, but something felt off. I couldn't explain it. I got back into bed but stayed sitting up, listening, trying to catch any sound I might have missed. After a minute or two, I checked my phone. 2:14 a.m. That seemed about right. Maybe a little later than I expected, but close enough. I set it down on the nightstand. Then I noticed something else. The room smelled different, faint, almost like after a thunderstorm, that sharp, clean smell. I sat there trying to place it. It wasn't strong, just enough to notice. I got up again and walked toward the window. The smell seemed stronger near it. I pulled the blinds back again. Still nothing outside, just darkness. I opened the window slightly. Cool air came in, normal air, no smell. I closed it again, turned back toward the room. That's when I saw it again. Not on the wall, on the floor this time. A faint line near the foot of the bed. I froze. It was the same shape, same width, same soft glow, but it wasn't moving. Not yet. I didn't move either, just watched. After a few seconds, it started to shift, slowly, sliding across the floor, toward the wall. I took a step back. My heart was beating faster now. The line reached the base of the wall, then climbed, same as before. No distortion, no change in shape, just moving upward. I felt that tightness in my chest again, that sense that something was happening just outside of what I could understand. I looked at the window again. Still nothing, no source, no explanation. I turned back. The line had reached halfway up the wall. Then it stopped. Just for a second, completely still. Then it dimmed, faster this time. Within a second, it was gone. The room was dark again. I stood there, not moving, waiting. Nothing came back. After a while, I got back into bed. I didn't lie down right away, just sat there, staring at the wall where it had been. Eventually, I checked my phone again. 2:26 a.m. I frowned. That didn't make sense. It hadn't felt like 12 minutes, maybe 3 or 4. I set the phone down slowly, lay back, closed my eyes. I didn't fall asleep right away. I kept thinking about the way the light moved, too steady, too controlled, and how it didn't seem to come from anywhere. At some point, I must have drifted off, because when I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight coming through the window normally. Everything looked fine, but when I got up and looked at the wall across from my bed, there was something I didn't recognize at first. A faint, straight mark, barely visible, running vertically, exactly where the light had first appeared. The power went out right as I was rinsing a plate. No warning, just everything cutting to black at once. The fridge hum stopped, the overhead light snapped off, even the little standby light on the microwave disappeared. I stood there for a second with my hands in the sink, waiting for it to come back. Sometimes it does that around here when the weather's bad, but it didn't. I looked out the kitchen window. The whole street was dark. No porch lights, no TV glow through windows. Just this faint orange from the sky, like the usual light pollution. It had been storming earlier that evening. Not heavy, just steady rain and low clouds. By the time the power went out, the rain had mostly stopped, but everything was still wet. I could hear water dripping off the gutter outside. I grabbed my phone off the counter and turned the flashlight on. No signal. That wasn't totally unusual during outages, but it still added to the feeling. I walked into the living room, checking if anything had tripped inside. Fuse box looked fine, no weird smells, nothing obvious. The house just felt empty without the background noise. No fridge, no clock ticking, nothing. I opened the front door and stepped out onto the porch. The air was damp and cool, the kind of quiet you get after rain, but heavier. A couple houses down, I saw someone else outside, my neighbor, Rena. She was standing at the end of her driveway, looking up at the sky. "Yours out too?" I called. "Yeah," she said. "Whole street, I think." Her voice sounded flat, like it didn't carry properly. I stepped off the porch and walked toward her. As I got closer, I noticed she wasn't just looking up randomly. She was focused on one spot. I followed her gaze. At first, I didn't see anything unusual, just clouds, low and thick, kind of reflecting the usual city glow. Then I noticed the color. There was a patch of sky, maybe directly above the middle of the street, that looked slightly off. Faintly blue, not bright, not glowing like a light source, just tinted, like someone had layered a soft blue filter over that section of clouds. "Do you see that?" she said. "What is that?" She didn't answer. We both just stood there watching it. It didn't move with the clouds. That's what stood out first. The rest of the sky was shifting slowly like you'd expect after rain, but that blue patch stayed fixed. I stepped a little further into the road to get a better angle. The moment I did, I felt something strange under my feet. A faint vibration. Not strong, not like something shaking the ground. More like a low buzz, similar to standing near heavy machinery far away. I paused, testing it by shifting my weight. It was definitely there. "Can you feel that?" I asked. Rena hesitated. "Feel what?" "Like, the ground. Is it vibrating?" She stepped forward a bit, then stopped. "Yeah, I think so." We both went quiet again. The blue patch in the sky seemed to deepen slightly. Still faint, but more noticeable now that we were focused on it. I realized something else. There were no other lights anywhere. Not just the street. The entire horizon was dark. No distant glow from town, no flickering from other neighborhoods. It was like everything for miles had gone out. That didn't seem right. The vibration got a little stronger. I could feel it in my chest now, not just through my shoes. Rena wrapped her arms around herself. "I don't like this." "Probably just a transformer or something," I said, but it didn't sound convincing even to me. The air felt heavier, like before a storm, but there were no clouds building. No wind either. Then the blue patch changed. It didn't expand exactly. It just sharpened. The edges became more defined, like it was separating from the rest of the sky. And for a second, I thought I saw depth to it, not like a hole or anything obvious, just a sense that it wasn't flat like the clouds around it. I squinted, trying to focus. That's when the vibration peaked. It wasn't loud, but it was intense. My ears started to feel pressured, like I needed to pop them. Rena stepped back suddenly. "Okay, no, that's..." She didn't finish. The blue light brightened. Not suddenly, not like a flash. Just a quick, smooth increase, like someone turning up a dimmer switch. For maybe 3 or 4 seconds, the whole street was tinted blue. Not illuminated exactly. Shadows were still there, but everything had that color to it. The houses, the road, even Rena's face. During that moment, I noticed something above us. Shapes. Not solid, not clear, but something moved across that blue patch. Large, slow, like shadows passing behind frosted glass. I couldn't make out edges or details, just movement. My stomach dropped. I took a step back without thinking. The vibration held steady, almost like it was waiting. Then it all stopped. The blue faded instantly, like it had been switched off. The vibration cut out at the same time, and a second later, the power came back. Every house lit up at once. Streetlights flickered on. The hum of electricity filled the air again. It was so sudden it made me flinch. Rena let out a shaky laugh. "What the hell was that?" I didn't answer. I was still looking at the sky. It was normal again. Just low clouds reflecting the usual orange glow. No blue, no shapes. Just regular night. We stood there for a bit longer, but nothing else happened. Eventually, she went back inside. I did the same. The house felt loud again with everything running. I checked my phone. Still no signal for a minute or two. Then it came back. There were no alerts, no messages about outages or anything unusual. The next day, I asked a couple other neighbors if they saw anything. Most of them just mentioned the power cut. One guy, Malik, said his lights flickered twice before going out, but that was it. No one mentioned the sky. Later that afternoon, I walked out into the street again, just standing roughly where I had been. Everything looked completely normal, but when I looked down, I noticed something odd on the pavement. A faint discoloration, like a wide patch where the surface looked slightly dulled compared to the rest. It stretched across part of the road, right under where that blue patch had been. I rubbed my shoe over it, thinking maybe it was just leftover moisture or oil. It didn't change. It wasn't anything obvious. You'd walk right over it without noticing. But it was there. That night, the power stayed on. Everything was normal. Except every now and then, usually when it got really quiet, I'd feel that same faint vibration through the floor for a second or two. Not strong enough to be sure, just enough to make me stop and listen. I noticed it in my chest before I noticed it in my ears. I was sitting in the living room of my apartment just past 1 a.m. watching something, half paying attention. It was one of those nights where everything felt quiet in a normal way. No traffic outside, No voices from the neighbors, just the usual low hum of appliances and the occasional creak from the building settling. Then something changed. At first, I thought my heart was beating weird. There was this low, steady pressure, like a vibration, but not exactly a sound. It sat right in the middle of my chest, like when a subwoofer is too close and you feel it more than hear it. I muted the TV. The room went silent, but the feeling stayed. That's when I realized it wasn't internal. It was coming from outside. I stood up slowly. The pressure didn't get louder or softer, but it became easier to notice once I focused on it. It wasn't rhythmic like a machine or engine. It was constant. Flat, like a tone too low to actually hear. I walked toward the window. The curtains were drawn, but I could see the faint glow of the streetlight through them. The pressure didn't change. If anything, it felt slightly stronger near the window. I reached out and pulled the curtain aside. Outside, everything looked normal. The street was empty. A row of parked cars, the same streetlight casting that dull yellow glow onto the pavement. Nothing moving. I opened the window a few inches. Cool night air slipped in. The pressure stayed exactly the same. That was the part that didn't make sense. If it was coming from outside, it should have changed when I opened the window. Gotten clearer, louder. But it didn't. It felt the same, like it wasn't traveling through the air at all. I stood there for a minute, trying to figure it out. Then I noticed something else. The usual background noises were gone. No distant traffic, no hum from other apartments. Even the faint buzz from the streetlight seemed quieter, like everything else had been pushed down underneath that low pressure. I stepped back from the window. The feeling stayed with me. I checked the time on my phone. 1:14 a.m. I don't know why I did that. It just felt important to mark it. I walked toward the front door. There was a moment where I hesitated with my hand on the knob. Not because I was scared, more because I had this weird expectation that something would be different on the other side. I opened the door. The moment I stepped outside, it stopped completely. No fade, no gradual drop, just gone. The air felt normal again, light, quiet in a regular way. I stood there on the small concrete landing outside my apartment, looking up and down the street. Everything looked the same as it had through the window. Still, empty. But now I could hear things again. A car somewhere far off, wind moving lightly through the trees, even the faint electrical buzz of the streetlight. I stepped fully outside and let the door close behind me. The pressure didn't come back. I walked a few steps out toward the sidewalk. The night felt normal. I looked up at the sky, clear, stars scattered across it. Nothing unusual. I stayed there for maybe a minute, just listening. Everything stayed the same. Then I turned around and went back inside. The moment the door closed behind me, the pressure returned. Instant, like flipping a switch. It hit my chest again, that same low, steady hum I couldn't actually hear. I froze in the entryway. That didn't make sense. I opened the door again, stepped outside. Gone. Stepped back in, back again. I repeated it once more just to be sure. Outside, nothing. Inside, it was there. I stood there for a while, halfway between the door and the living room, trying to figure out what could cause something like that. It didn't feel like sound. It didn't behave like sound. I walked back toward the window. The pressure stayed with me. I looked up at the ceiling. There was nothing there. Just the same off-white paint, the same light fixture. But the feeling seemed stronger when I stood directly under it. Not by much. Just enough to notice. I moved a few steps to the side. Slightly less. Back under it. Stronger again. I stayed there for a few seconds, standing still, looking up. The pressure didn't change, didn't pulse, didn't shift, just stayed constant. Then just for a second it stopped. I hadn't moved, I hadn't done anything. It just cut out. The silence that followed felt deeper than before. Then it came back, same intensity, same steady presence. I checked the time again. 1:22 a.m. That caught me off guard. I was sure I hadn't been standing there that long. It felt like a few minutes at most. I went back to the couch and sat down. The pressure stayed. I turned the TV back on, but the sound felt distant compared to it. Eventually, after a while, I must have fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was morning. Sunlight filled the room. Everything felt normal. No pressure, no hum. I got up and went about my day like usual. Around the same time, I found myself standing near the door again, waiting, listening. And just as I was about to convince myself it wasn't going to happen again, I felt it. That same low, steady pressure settling into my chest. And without thinking, I reached for the door. I saw the headlights before I saw the road. It was early morning, just before sunrise, and I was driving through a stretch of back roads in western Pennsylvania. I'd left my sister Dana's place around 5 a.m. to beat traffic, but I didn't expect the fog. It rolled in fast. 1 minute the road was clear, the next it was like driving into a wall of gray. I slowed down immediately. The fog was thick enough that my headlights just bounced back at me, lighting up the air instead of the road. Everything beyond maybe 20 feet was swallowed. I kept both hands on the wheel, leaning forward slightly, trying to focus on the faint outline of the center line. The world shrank down to just that narrow slice of pavement. No houses, no trees, just fog. Then I saw them, 2 points of light ahead, faint at first, barely visible through the haze. I assumed it was another car coming toward me. That was normal. The road wasn't busy, but it wasn't empty either. I eased my foot off the gas a little more. The lights grew brighter as I got closer, but something felt off. They weren't moving the way they should. On a straight road like that, oncoming headlights usually shift slightly as the car approaches, the angle changing with distance. These didn't. They stayed fixed, perfectly aligned. I squinted through the windshield. The fog distorted everything, but I could still make out that the lights were higher than they should be. Not by much, just enough to notice. I slowed down further. Now I was creeping along at maybe 15 miles an hour. The headlights stayed in place. They didn't get noticeably closer. Didn't drift, didn't dip or rise. Just hovered there in the fog. I tapped the brake lightly. The car slowed even more. I leaned forward, trying to see if there was a vehicle behind the lights. There wasn't. At least, I couldn't see one. Just the lights themselves, floating in the gray. I rolled down my window slightly. Cold, damp air filled the car. The fog smelled faintly earthy, like wet ground and leaves. I listened for an engine. Nothing. No hum, no tires on pavement, just silence. I looked back at the lights. Still there, still hovering. I came to a complete stop. The car idled quietly. The lights didn't react. They didn't brighten or dim. They didn't move at all. I checked my mirrors out of habit. Nothing behind me, just more fog. When I looked forward again, the lights seemed slightly closer. Or maybe I was just imagining it. I couldn't tell. I sat there for a few seconds, debating whether to turn around. But the road was too narrow for that without backing up a long way. And I didn't like the idea of reversing in that fog. So I made a decision. I eased the car forward again. Slowly. Very slowly. The headlights stayed fixed. As I got closer, I realized something else. They weren't level with the road. They were above it. Maybe 3 or 4 feet higher than where headlights should be. That's when the tight feeling in my chest started. I kept moving forward. The fog seemed to thin slightly. Not clearing completely, but enough that I could see a little more of the space around the lights. There was no outline of a car, no shape, just the lights, suspended in midair. I stopped again, closer this time, maybe 30 feet away. I stared at them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. They didn't flicker, didn't blink, just a steady, dull white. I reached over and turned off my headlights. The road in front of me disappeared into darkness, but the floating lights remained, unchanged. That's when the fog shifted. It didn't clear all at once, it just thinned enough in that specific spot. For a brief second, I could see the road beneath the lights, empty, nothing there, no vehicle, no structure, just pavement. The lights hovered above it. Then, as the fog continued to shift, the lights dimmed, not fading out gradually, just becoming less visible as the air cleared. Within a few seconds, they were gone, completely. The fog thinned enough that I could see farther down the road. There was nothing there, no car, no taillights driving away, no turnoff where something could have gone, just an empty stretch of road disappearing into the distance. I sat there for a moment, my headlights still off, then I turned them back on. The beam cut through what was left of the fog. The road looked normal again. I drove forward slowly, passing the spot where the lights had been. There was nothing unusual about it, just asphalt, a faded center line, grass along the edges. I kept going. The fog gradually thinned as I drove farther. By the time I reached the next intersection, it had almost cleared completely. I checked the clock on the dashboard. 5:32 a.m. That made me pause. I was sure it had been around 5:10 when I first hit the fog. The stretch of road I'd been on shouldn't have taken that long. I tried to replay what had just happened, how long I'd been sitting there watching the lights. It didn't feel like 20 minutes, more like a few minutes at most. I drove the rest of the way home without seeing anything else. But every time another car approached from the opposite direction, I found myself watching the headlights carefully, making sure they were attached to something. And when I finally pulled into my driveway and shut off the engine, I sat there for a minute, staring down the empty street, half expecting to see those same two lights hanging there in the distance. But the road stayed empty. The highway message board started glitching before anything showed up in the sky. I worked overnight maintenance for the State Transportation Department in northern Arizona. My job was mostly driving between the electronic message signs along a stretch of highway that ran through miles of desert. Those signs are the big digital boards that warn drivers about road work, accidents, or weather conditions. Most nights were quiet. A few trucks passing through, maybe a car every few minutes, but mostly just empty road and desert wind. My name's Scott Ramirez. I'd been doing that shift for about 6 months when this happened. It was around 2:40 in the morning when the first sign started flashing nonsense. I was parked on the shoulder near mile marker 118 when the message board ahead of me flickered. Normally, it just displayed road work ahead during my shift, but the words disappeared. The board filled with random symbols and blocks of light. Then it went blank. I thought the controller box had failed. But before I could step out of the truck, the next sign down the highway flickered too. Then the one behind me. 3 message boards went dark at the same time. The truck radio crackled and cut out. The desert wind stopped. That part hit me first. The wind out there almost never dies completely. But suddenly the dust along the shoulder wasn't moving. The weeds beside the road were still. I stepped out of the truck and looked up. The stars above the highway looked distorted. A wide section of sky bent inward toward the center of something invisible drifting across the night. The light from the stars curved like it was passing through glass. The distortion moved slowly along the direction of the highway. As it passed overhead, the streetlights along the road dimmed slightly. The metal signposts beside the road ticked softly like they were adjusting under pressure. The distortion stopped above the highway for a few seconds. Then the asphalt lit up faintly. Not bright, just a pale glow washing across the road and the desert around it. Every reflector on the road shimmered under the light. Then the glow vanished. The distortion shot across the sky and disappeared beyond the hills faster than anything I'd ever seen. The wind returned instantly. Dust began drifting across the road again. The truck radio blasted back to life. The highway signs rebooted. Everything returned to normal, except for the car. A black sedan sat parked on the shoulder behind my truck. I hadn't heard it arrive. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, black ties, no jackets even though the desert air had turned colder. One of them was tall with dark hair combed straight back. The other had a broader build and pale skin that looked almost gray under the highway lights. They were watching the road. The tall one walked toward me. "You observed the passage," he said. It wasn't a question. "Yeah," I replied slowly. "What was that thing?" The shorter man glanced up toward the sky. "A transit object," he said. "That thing bent the stars." "Yes." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. "So you know what it was." Neither of them confirmed it. Instead, the tall man looked toward the digital message sign. "You also noticed the system interruption," he said. "The boards glitched. That's common during those events." "For what events?" He didn't answer. The shorter man stepped closer to the edge of the highway and looked down the empty road. "You're the only technician assigned to this section tonight," he said. "How do you know that?" "We checked the maintenance schedule." That response made me uneasy. "You guys from the transportation department?" I asked. "No." "Military?" "No." "Then who are you?" The tall man paused before answering. "We observe unusual crossings." "Crossings of what?" He looked up at the sky again. "Things that move through this region." "That's not helpful." "It's accurate." The wind pushed dust across the highway again. A truck passed far down the road, its headlights sweeping across the desert. I looked back toward the sky where the distortion had vanished. So what exactly flew over this highway? The two men exchanged a quick glance. Then the shorter one said quietly, "Something traveling far beyond this place." The tall man stepped back toward the sedan. "You should log the sign malfunction as routine electrical interference," he said. "That's not what caused it. It will be the explanation that remains." I crossed my arms. "What happens if that thing comes back?" He paused before getting into the car. Then he said softly, "It doesn't repeat the same crossing." Both men got into the sedan. The engine started quietly. As the car rolled onto the highway and disappeared into the darkness, the shorter man lowered the window. "You lost about 40 seconds during the passage," he said. "I was standing here the whole time. Time compresses near certain events." The sedan vanished down the empty highway. Later that morning, when I checked the sign controller logs, every message board had shut down for exactly 40 seconds. But according to the timestamp, that shutdown started almost a minute before the first sign ever glitched. The first thing I noticed was the birds. I was delivering packages that morning, one of the rural routes outside Redding, California. The job wasn't glamorous, just driving a white van down long stretches of road where houses were half a mile apart and people left snacks out for the drivers. It was late winter, one of those pale gray mornings where the fog hangs low over the fields, but the sun keeps trying to break through. I had stopped at a cattle gate to drop off a small box for a rancher named Eli Navarro. His mailbox was mounted on a wooden post beside the gravel road. The place was quiet except for the wind moving through dry grass and a distant tractor somewhere in the valley. Normally there were birds everywhere out there, starlings, crows, sometimes hawks circling above the hills. That morning there weren't any. It wasn't something I consciously noticed at first. It was more like a feeling that the air was missing a layer of sound. No wings, no chirping, nothing. I put the package in the mailbox and turned back toward the van. That's when the shadow passed over the road. Not a fast shadow, like a plane moving overhead. It was slower and broader, like something enormous gliding between the sun and the ground. I looked up immediately. There was nothing there, just a sheet of fog thinning out over the hills. The shadow moved again across the gravel road, stretching along the fence line. It was so wide it covered the entire field for a moment. Then it drifted away and vanished. I stood there staring at the sky longer than I probably should have. My first thought was that a cloud had moved across the sun, but the sky above me was completely clear except for the fog layer sitting lower near the hills. No cloud overhead, no airplane sound, nothing. The birds were still gone. I got back in the van and started driving again, but the feeling stuck with me. That quiet, hollow atmosphere, like something had passed through and pulled the sound with it. About 5 minutes later, I turned onto a narrow road that cut between two long cattle pastures. That's when my GPS froze. The screen showed my location stuck in the middle of the previous road, even though I'd already turned. The map didn't move with the van anymore. I tapped the screen a couple times. Nothing changed. Then the radio cut out. Not static, just silence. The engine kept running normally, but everything electronic seemed to stall at once. The quiet inside the van felt thick. As I drove farther down the road, I noticed something else. The cattle were all standing still. Dozens of them scattered across the pasture, but every single one had its head raised toward the sky. None of them were eating. None of them were moving, just staring upward. I slowed the van almost to a crawl. The fog had started lifting a little, and I could see the sky clearly now. That's when I saw the distortion. At first it looked like heat waves rising off asphalt, except this was high above the fields. A ripple in the sky, barely visible, like transparent glass bending the light around it. It stretched across a long section of air, maybe a few hundred feet above the ground. The ripple moved slowly across the valley. As it passed over the cattle, the sunlight dimmed slightly again. Not completely dark, just duller. My heart started beating harder. I reached for my phone to record it. The screen lit up for a second, then shut off. Battery dead. It had been almost full 5 minutes earlier. The distortion slid across the sky for another few seconds. Then it was gone. The sunlight returned to normal. The cattle immediately lowered their heads and went back to grazing like nothing had happened. My radio suddenly popped back on with a loud burst of static that made me flinch. The GPS map snapped forward and corrected my location. Everything in the van went back to normal. I sat there gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then I saw the car. It was parked on the side of the road about 50 yards ahead, a black sedan, clean, polished, completely out of place on that dusty farm road. Two men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, black jackets, black ties, white shirts. No hats, no coats despite the cool morning air. They weren't talking. They were watching my van approach. I slowed down and stopped a few yards away. Neither of them waved or signaled. They just stood there calmly like they had been waiting. I rolled down the window. "You guys need help?" I asked. The taller one stepped forward. His expression was neutral, almost blank. "Did you observe anything unusual just now?" he asked. The question made my stomach tighten. Like what? "Any changes in the sky?" I hesitated. The shorter man leaned against the sedan, arms folded, watching me carefully. "Maybe," I said. The tall man nodded slightly. "Atmospheric distortion," he said. "That didn't look like weather." He smiled politely. "Many things in the atmosphere appear unusual from ground level. You two meteorologists?" "No." "Then who are you?" He didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small black notebook. He wrote something quickly without looking away from me. Then he closed it. "You deliver packages along this route every day?" he asked. "Most mornings." He nodded again, like that confirmed something. "You should take a different road tomorrow," he said. "Why?" "Temporary testing." "What kind of testing?" The shorter man finally spoke. "Nothing that concerns you." That answer annoyed me. "You guys shut down my GPS and radio for your testing?" The tall man shook his head. "Those effects were incidental." He stepped back toward the sedan. Before getting in, he looked at me one more time. "Sometimes the sky behaves in ways that are better not examined too closely." The shorter man opened the passenger door. "You didn't see anything that requires reporting," he added calmly. Then, both of them got into the car. The engine started, quietly. They drove past my van and continued down the road toward the hills. Within seconds, the sedan disappeared behind a bend in the fence line. I waited there for a minute before pulling away. The rest of my deliveries went normally. But every time I passed an open field that day, I caught myself looking up, watching the sky, just in case it moved again. I notice the sky first because I run the same trail almost every night, and the sky is usually the only thing that changes. My name's Aaron Delaney. I was 29 at the time and working late shifts at a warehouse outside Flagstaff. Running after work had become a routine thing, mostly to clear my head after 10 hours of forklifts and fluorescent lights. There's a trail that loops around a dry canyon about 15 minutes outside town. Hardly anyone goes there after dark. It's not dangerous or anything, just empty desert and juniper trees. That night was colder than usual. Early winter. No moon. The air had that dry sharpness where every breath feels clean but a little painful in your chest. I parked my car at the gravel lot around 11:20 p.m. There were no other cars there. Just my old Civic and the faint outline of the trailhead sign that someone had covered in stickers. I remember the stars being really clear when I stepped out. Arizona sky. You could see the Milky Way stretched across like dust. I put my earbuds in, but didn't turn music on right away. Sometimes I liked hearing the desert at night. The wind moves differently out there. Long, slow pushes through the brush. The first mile was normal, gravel crunching under my shoes, my breath fogging a little in the cold. A few distant coyote sounds way out in the valley. Then the wind stopped. It didn't fade or die down. It just stopped all at once like someone shut a door. I slowed a little because the quiet felt strange. Desert quiet is already pretty deep, but this was heavier. No brush moving, no insects, just the sound of my own shoes. That's when I noticed the stars. At first, it looked like my eyes adjusting. Sometimes when you run at night, your vision does weird things with light, but this wasn't that. A small section of sky above the canyon, maybe the size of a dinner plate if you held it at arm's length, shifted slightly. Not fast, just slid. It was subtle enough that if you weren't staring at the stars, you'd miss it. But I'd been looking straight up while catching my breath, and suddenly the star pattern didn't match where it had been a second earlier. I blinked and stared harder. The stars outside that patch stayed perfectly still. The rest of the sky looked normal, but that small section had moved a little to the left, like someone had taken a cutout piece of sky and nudged it. I laughed quietly because my first thought was that I was dizzy. I started jogging again. The trail curved along the canyon ridge, and the sky stayed visible through the gaps in the trees. I kept glancing up at the same patch of stars. A minute passed. Then it shifted again, this time downward. Not the stars themselves moving across the sky the way they normally do over hours. This was different. The pattern stayed intact, like a photograph sliding across glass. I slowed to a walk. I tried to focus on one bright star near the edge of the moving section. It drifted slightly and then stopped again. The desert stayed completely silent. Even the coyotes had stopped. I took my earbuds out and listened. Nothing. It felt like the air itself had thickened. For a few seconds, I wondered if there was some kind of atmospheric distortion happening. Heat layers sometimes bend light weirdly. But it was freezing out there. No heat shimmer. Then something else happened. The moving patch of sky seemed to dim, not disappear, just lose brightness, like something large had passed between the stars and the ground. I couldn't see any shape, no edges or outline, but the stars inside that section grew faint for maybe 2 seconds. Then they returned to normal. The pattern slid once more, this time slowly upward. I stood there watching for maybe a full minute. My heart rate had dropped from the run, but I could feel a weird tightness in my chest. Eventually, the patch stopped moving entirely. The stars stayed exactly where they were. The wind returned suddenly, pushing through the brush again. It was like someone had pressed play on the environment. I shook my head and started jogging again. Faster this time. I finished the rest of the loop without looking up again. The trail ended at the same gravel lot where I'd parked. It took me about 35 minutes to run the loop. My car was the only vehicle there when I left, and it was still the only one when I got back. Except 2 men were leaning against it. I saw them from about 20 yards away. At first, I thought maybe they were cops. The trail technically closes at dusk, and sometimes rangers swing by to tell people to leave. But these guys didn't look like rangers. They wore black suits. Actual suits. Black jackets, black pants, white shirts, thin black ties. Both had dark sunglasses on, even though it was almost midnight. They stood on either side of my car like they owned it. The taller one had his arms folded. The other had his hands resting on the roof. Neither of them moved when I approached. I slowed to a walk about 10 feet away. That's my car, I said. The taller man tilted his head slightly. We know, he said. His voice was calm, not threatening, just flat. I waited for them to move. They didn't. The shorter one pushed off the roof of my car and stepped closer. Did you enjoy the illusion? He asked. For a second, I didn't understand what he meant. Sorry? The sky, he said. You were looking at it. My stomach tightened. You guys were watching me? We were observing, the tall one said. Observing what? He didn't answer immediately. He looked past me toward the canyon trail like he expected someone else to walk out of the darkness. Then he said, It's not something people usually notice. I laughed nervously. You mean the stars moving? Neither of them reacted. The shorter man looked at the sky above the parking lot. You noticed the distortion, he said. Yeah, I said slowly. What was that? Neither of them answered right away. The wind moved through the trees again and rattled the trail sign. Finally, the tall one spoke. An optical effect, he said. That doesn't make sense, I said. It doesn't need to. The shorter man studied my face like he was trying to memorize it. How often do you run here? He asked. Most nights. After work? Yeah. He nodded slightly, like that information meant something. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small notepad. He wrote something quickly and tore the page out. He didn't hand it to me. He just folded it and slipped it back into his pocket. You should consider running somewhere else for a while, he said. Why? He looked at the tall man briefly before answering. Maintenance, he said. That's not an answer. The tall man finally stepped away from the car. You're safe, he said calmly. Nothing followed you. The way he said it made my skin crawl. I didn't say anything followed me. He didn't respond. The shorter man opened the passenger door of my car without asking. I froze. He leaned inside, glanced around quickly, then closed the door again. What the hell are you doing? I said. Making sure. he replied. Making sure of what? He ignored the question. Then he stepped back and gestured toward the driver's side door. You can go home now. I stared at them for a second. Neither of them looked hostile, but something about them felt wrong in a way I couldn't explain. Their faces were normal, their voices were calm, yet the whole interaction felt rehearsed, like they had done this exact thing many times before. I unlocked my car slowly and got inside. They stepped away to give me room. Before I shut the door, I looked up at the sky again. The stars were completely normal. No moving patch, no dimming, just the same steady patterns. When I looked back down, the two men were already walking toward a black sedan parked near the edge of the lot. I hadn't noticed it when I arrived. No headlights, no interior lights. They got in and the engine started quietly. As they drove past my car, the shorter one rolled his window down slightly. Try not to watch the sky too closely, he said. Then the car pulled onto the dirt road and disappeared into the darkness. I sat there for a while before driving. When I finally started the engine, the clock on my dashboard read 12:48 a.m. That confused me. My run should have ended around midnight. I drove home slowly, checking the sky every few minutes. Nothing moved again. Just the stars exactly where they were supposed to be. The bridge lights went dark before the river changed. I worked overnight security at a small river crossing in eastern Pennsylvania. It wasn't a big highway bridge, just a narrow two-lane span over the Susquehanna with a small control shack where someone stayed overnight to monitor traffic and the drawbridge controls for barge traffic. My name's Ryan Calder. Most of my shifts were quiet. After midnight, the only vehicles that passed through were truckers and the occasional late commuter. The river usually made constant noise under the bridge. Water hitting the support pylons, wind moving across the surface. But that night, something strange happened around 2:05 a.m. The river went quiet, not gradually. One moment I could hear the water moving under the bridge. The next moment, like someone had turned the volume down on the entire river. I stepped outside the control shack and looked over the railing. The current looked slower. Not stopped exactly, but moving in a strange, smooth way like the surface had flattened. Then the bridge lights flickered. The row of yellow lamps running along the guardrail dimmed slightly. I looked up. A section of stars above the river looked wrong. They weren't hidden, they were bent. The light from them curved slightly toward the center of a wide shape, drifting across the sky. The distortion moved slowly along the length of the river. As it passed overhead, the bridge lights dimmed again. The hum from the electrical box inside the shack faded. The air felt heavier. For a few seconds, the entire bridge seemed quieter than anything I'd ever heard. Then the distortion stopped directly above the river. The water beneath it began to glow faintly, not bright, just a pale white shimmer spreading across the current. The glow lasted maybe 3 seconds. Then the distortion shot forward across the sky and vanished behind the hills. The river noise returned instantly. The current resumed its normal churning sound. The bridge lights brightened again. Everything returned to normal, except for the car. A black sedan sat parked near the entrance to the bridge. I hadn't heard it arrive. 2 men stood beside it. Both wore black suits, white shirts, black ties. No coats despite the cold air coming off the river. One of them was tall with dark hair slicked straight back. The other had a broader build and pale skin that looked almost gray under the bridge lights. They were watching the river. The tall one walked toward me. "You observed the disturbance," he said. It wasn't phrased like a question. "Yeah," I replied slowly. "What was that thing?" The shorter man glanced up at the sky. "A passing object," he said. "That thing bent the stars." "Yes." The way he said it made my stomach tighten. "So you know what it was." Neither of them confirmed it. Instead, the tall man looked down at the river again. "You also noticed the water movement change," he said. "The current looked slower." "That's common during those events." "For what events?" He didn't answer. The shorter man stepped closer to the bridge railing and watched the dark water moving below. "You're the only person stationed here tonight," he said. "How do you know that?" "We reviewed the bridge schedule." That response made me uneasy. "You guys from the State Department or something?" I asked. "No." "Military?" "No." "Then who are you?" The tall man paused before answering. We monitor unusual passages. Passages of what? He looked up toward the sky again. Things that move through this region. That's not helpful. It's accurate. The wind moved across the river again, sending small ripples through the water. I looked back toward the stars. So what exactly passed over this bridge? The two men exchanged a quick glance. Then the shorter one said quietly, "Something traveling along a route far beyond here." The tall man stepped back toward the sedan. "You should log the light fluctuation as routine electrical interference," he said. "That's not what caused it. It will be the explanation that remains." I crossed my arms. "What happens if that thing comes back?" He paused before getting into the car. Then he said softly, "It doesn't travel the same crossing twice." Both men got into the sedan. The engine started quietly. As the car rolled off the bridge toward the empty highway, the shorter man lowered the window. "You lost about 40 seconds during the passage," he said. "I didn't go anywhere." Time compresses slightly near those events. The sedan disappeared down the road. I stood there listening to the river for a while before going back inside the shack. Later that morning, when I checked the bridge control logs, the system showed a 40-second interruption in the electrical feed. But according to the timestamp, that interruption happened almost a minute before the bridge lights ever flickered. I noticed the feeling before I noticed the sky. I was about 3 blocks from my apartment, walking home along a quiet street near the river. It was just after midnight, and the air had that cool, damp smell you get in early spring when the snow is mostly gone, but the ground still holds moisture. The streetlights were spaced far apart, leaving long, dark stretches between them. My footsteps echoed faintly off the parked cars lining the curb. I'd been at my friend Marcus's place watching a late basketball game and stayed longer than I planned. By the time I started walking home, the neighborhood had gone quiet. No traffic, no people outside, just the low hum of distant highway noise and the occasional creak of branches in the wind. I had my hands in my jacket pockets and was staring down at the sidewalk when the feeling hit me. It wasn't fear exactly, more like a sudden awareness, like someone had just started looking at me. I stopped walking. The quiet around the street seemed to thicken. I turned around slowly, scanning the houses behind me. All the windows were dark. One porch light down the block flickered slightly, but there was no movement anywhere. I listened for footsteps or voices. Nothing. After a few seconds, I shook it off and kept walking. But the feeling stayed. That same strange sense of being watched. It wasn't coming from behind me or from the houses. It felt higher. I glanced up at the rooftops on both sides of the street. Nothing there either. Just antennas and chimneys silhouetted against the sky. Then I looked higher. The sky above the street was clear, full of stars. The river valley gets pretty dark at night, so you can see a lot more stars there than in the city center. For a few seconds I just stood there looking up. Then I noticed one of them moving. It was faint, barely brighter than the others, drifting slowly across the sky. At first, I assumed it was a satellite. I see them sometimes when the sky is clear. The light moved steadily from west to east, sliding past the other stars. I started walking again, still watching it. The movement was smooth, silent, normal. Then it stopped. Not slowed down. Stopped. I blinked a few times to make sure my eyes weren't playing tricks on me. The light stayed exactly where it was. The stars around it remained steady. Only that one had moved. Now it just hung there. Perfectly still. I slowed my pace until I was barely moving. Something about the way it stopped made my chest tighten. Satellites don't stop. At least I'd never seen one do that. I stood in the middle of the sidewalk, staring straight up. The light stayed frozen in place. The street around me was quiet enough that I could hear the faint ripple of water from the river a block away. Then the light shifted, not forward, sideways, just a tiny movement to the left. Then it stopped again. My stomach did that slow sinking thing you get when something doesn't make sense. I stepped backward into the edge of a driveway so I could see more of the sky between the houses. The star remained still. I counted slowly in my head. 1, 2, 3, 5. 10 seconds. Then it faded. Not like a shooting star or a flare burning out, it just dimmed, slowly, until it blended into the sky. I kept staring at the spot where it had been. The surrounding stars looked exactly the same. Nothing moved anymore. I stood there another minute, waiting to see if it would come back. It didn't. Eventually, I started walking again. The strange watched feeling faded gradually, like someone had turned their attention somewhere else. By the time I reached the corner near my building, the street felt normal again. The hallway light inside the apartment building buzzed faintly as I pushed through the front door. I climbed the stairs to the second floor and unlocked my apartment. The place was quiet and still. I dropped my keys on the counter and walked over to the window that faces the river. For a moment, I considered stepping onto the fire escape to look at the sky again. Instead, I just stood there inside the room, staring out through the glass. The sky above the buildings was empty now. Stars scattered across it like always, nothing moving. Eventually, I went to bed, but when I checked my phone before turning off the light, I noticed the time. 12:38 a.m. That didn't seem right. Marcus's place is only about a 10-minute walk from my apartment. I was sure I'd left around midnight, and the walk home had felt longer than usual, though I couldn't explain why. I set the phone down and turned off the lamp. The room went dark. For a few seconds, I stared up at the ceiling. Then, through the thin gap in the curtains, I thought a faint point of light outside shift slightly in the sky. But when I sat up to look more closely, it was already gone. I noticed the silence first. I was driving home from my sister's place around 1:30 in the morning. She lives out past the edge of town where the neighborhoods give way to farmland. It's the kind of road where you can drive 10 minutes without seeing another car, especially that late. The weather had been warm during the day, but the night air cooled fast and a light haze was starting to form above the fields. My windows were cracked open and the crickets had been loud the whole drive. Then suddenly they stopped, not gradually, just cut off. At first I thought maybe I'd crossed into a stretch where there weren't any trees, but when I looked out both sides of the road, the fields and hedgerows looked exactly the same as the miles before it. The only difference was the silence. No insects, no rustling grass, not even the faint hum of power lines. The quiet felt heavy enough that I turned the radio down just to check. The engine was the only sound left. That was when something flashed above the road. Not lightning. Too small. I slowed instinctively and leaned forward over the steering wheel. About 100 yards ahead, something pale hung in the sky just above the tree line. It wasn't bright like a headlight, more like a dull white reflection, the way a piece of metal catches moonlight for a second. But it stayed there. The road ahead dipped slightly between two large fields, and the light hovered right above that dip like it was waiting for me. I slowed the car to maybe 20 miles an hour. The shape was difficult to focus on. Every time I tried to pin down the edges, they blurred into the sky. I could tell it wasn't round exactly. It looked flattened, almost like a smooth plate tipped slightly toward the road. The strange thing was how still it was. No drifting, no wobble, nothing that suggested wind. The air inside the car suddenly felt thicker. Not hot, not cold, just dense, like the pressure had shifted slightly. My ears didn't pop, but they felt like they might if the pressure changed anymore. I checked my mirrors without really thinking. The road behind me was empty. Just darkness and the faint glow of my taillights reflecting off the pavement. When I looked forward again, the object had moved. Not across the sky. Down. It had lowered closer to the treetops without making any sound at all. That was when the headlights hit it properly. For a split second, I saw the surface clearly. A smooth, dull gray shape with no markings, no lights of its own, nothing that looked mechanical. The headlights slid across it like water over glass, reflecting back at a strange angle. Then the reflection vanished as the object tilted slightly. I instinctively lifted my foot off the gas. The car coasted forward. The thing above the trees remained completely still, but something about its position made it feel like it was watching the road. Or watching me. The silence around the fields deepened. No wind touched the tall grass. No insects returned. Even the engine noise sounded strangely muted, like the air was swallowing the sound. I considered turning around. The thought came and went in a flash, but my hand stayed steady on the wheel. I kept moving forward slowly, but unsure whether getting closer or farther away was the better choice. When I was maybe 50 yards from the dip in the road, the object moved again. This time, it rose. Not fast, just a smooth upward glide like it weighed nothing at all. It climbed straight up from the tree line until it was maybe twice as high as the tallest trees. The movement was too clean to compare to anything I'd ever seen fly. No acceleration, no tilt or banking, just a change in position. Then it stopped again. The pressure in the air released slightly, enough that I felt it in my jaw. The object hung there for maybe 3 seconds. Then it tilted once more. The moment it tilted, it seemed to vanish, not shoot away, not blink out, but disappear upward into the darkness above the haze. I actually jerked my head back to follow it, expecting to see it climbing higher into the sky. There was nothing there. The stars looked normal. The haze drifted slowly across the fields, and the crickets started up again all at once. The sound was sudden, it made me jump. I drove the rest of the way home without stopping. The pressure in the air faded gradually as I left that stretch of farmland, and by the time I reached the main road, everything felt normal again. At home, I checked the time on the dashboard, 1:42 a.m. But when I unlocked my phone to send a message to my sister, the time read 1:56, 14 minutes difference. I went back outside and looked up at the sky for a long time before going in. The stars were clear, but every now and then I caught myself staring at one patch of darkness above the fields, half expecting something smooth and gray to tilt back into view. I was working the overnight shift in early July when this happened. It was around 2:05 in the morning, one of those slow hours where the radio usually stays quiet. Our department covered a lot of rural roads and farmland, so most nights involved driving long stretches with nothing but fields and tree lines on both sides. Dispatch called me about a report of a strange light near the county irrigation canal. The caller was a farmer who had been checking his water pumps and noticed a bright object hovering above the canal about half a mile from his house. At first, he assumed it was a helicopter flying low, but he told dispatch it had been there several minutes and he couldn't hear any sound. I was only about 10 minutes away, so I headed toward the area. The road running along the canal is narrow and mostly gravel. When I turned onto it, I could already see a glow ahead of me rising above the trees near the water. It wasn't flashing like aircraft lights normally do. It was steady. When I got closer, I saw the farmer's truck parked along the side of the canal road. He was standing outside with his flashlight pointed toward the water. He waved me down and pointed immediately. "There it is," he said. Hovering above the canal about 30 or 40 feet over the water was a circular object with a bright white ring of light underneath it. The light reflected off the surface of the canal and lit up the banks on both sides. The object itself looked dark against the night sky. It appeared maybe 20 to 25 feet across. "What do you think that is?" the farmer asked. I didn't answer right away because I was still trying to figure out the same thing. The strange part was how quiet it was. Even standing there in the open, I couldn't hear any engine noise or rotor blades. Something hovering that low should have been loud enough to hear clearly. This thing wasn't making any sound. I walked a little closer to the canal bank to get a better look. The object drifted slightly while I was watching it. It moved maybe 15 feet sideways along the canal in a smooth motion and then stopped again. There was no tilt or wobble like you'd see from a helicopter. It just glided through the air. I pulled out my radio to call dispatch and report what I was seeing. As soon as I pressed the transmit button, the radio filled with loud static. I tried again. Same result. Behind me, the farmer said quietly, "You hear that?" A faint humming sound had appeared in the air. It was low and steady, almost like distant electrical equipment. The ring of light underneath the object grew brighter. The water beneath it began to ripple outward in small waves, even though the canal had been completely calm before. I remember feeling a slight vibration through the dirt bank beneath my boots. Then the object began to descend, slowly. It lowered maybe 10 feet closer to the water before stopping again. The humming sound deepened slightly. For a moment, it just hovered there. Then the light dimmed suddenly. The object tilted slightly in the air, and without warning, it shot straight upward. The speed was unbelievable. 1 second, it was hovering low over the canal. The next, it was already high above the trees along the water. Within 2 seconds, it had become a small, bright point climbing into the night sky. Then it disappeared completely. The humming stopped instantly. My radio cleared up at the same moment. Dispatch came through asking if I had tried to transmit earlier because they had received a burst of interference from my unit. I stood there for a few seconds looking up at the empty sky before answering. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. By that time, the canal looked completely normal again. The water had settled back to its usual calm surface. We walked along the bank where the object had been hovering. The dirt and loose gravel near the water had been pushed outward in a rough circle about 20 feet across. Other than that, there was nothing unusual. No debris, no burn marks. The farmer confirmed that he saw the object shoot straight upward into the sky exactly the way I described. Later that morning, the report was filed as an unidentified aerial object observed hovering over the irrigation canal before ascending rapidly out of sight. A few days later, we were informed that no aircraft had been operating in that area at that time. I've responded to a lot of strange calls during night patrol over the years. Most of the time, there's eventually a logical explanation. But that night by the canal is one of the few incidents I've never been able to explain. Even now, when I drive that same gravel road during late patrol, I sometimes slow down near that stretch of water and glance toward the canal. Most nights it's just dark and quiet out there, but every once in a while I still catch myself scanning the sky above the trees, wondering if that silent white light might appear there again. I was working patrol on the midnight shift when this happened, a little after 2 in the morning. It was late November, cold and quiet out, the kind of night where the air feels still, and every sound carries a long distance. I had been a police officer for about 13 years at that point, and most of my time was spent covering the rural areas outside town. Dispatch called me about a report of strange lights near a gravel pit off County Road 9. The caller was a man who lived on a property about half a mile from the pit. He said he had been outside checking on some equipment when he noticed a bright object hovering low over the open pit. At first, he thought it might be a helicopter or maybe a drone, but he said it had been sitting there several minutes and he couldn't hear any sound coming from it. I was about 10 minutes away, so I told dispatch I'd head over and check it out. The gravel pit sits behind a line of trees with a dirt road leading down into the main excavation area. When I got close to the entrance road, I noticed a glow rising above the trees ahead of me. It was bright enough that I could see it from the highway. When I turned onto the dirt road and drove down toward the pit, the glow became much clearer. Hovering over the center of the pit was a circular object with a bright white ring of light underneath it. The light illuminated the piles of gravel and dirt below. I parked near the edge of the excavation area and stepped out of the cruiser. The object appeared maybe 25 or 30 feet across and was hovering about 40 feet above the ground. The upper part of it looked dark against the sky. What stood out immediately was the silence. Even in the open pit where sound normally echoes, I couldn't hear any engine noise or rotor blades. Something hovering that low should have been loud. This thing made no sound at all. I walked a little closer toward the center of the pit to get a better look. While I was watching it, the object drifted slightly. It moved maybe 10 feet sideways across the pit in a smooth motion and then stopped again. There was no tilt or wobble like you'd see with a helicopter. It just slid through the air. I pulled out my radio to call dispatch and report what I was seeing. The moment I pressed the transmit button, the radio filled with loud static. I tried again, same result. At the same time, a faint humming sound began to fill the air. It was low and steady, almost like distant electrical equipment. The ring of light underneath the object grew brighter. The loose gravel beneath it started shifting outward in a circular pattern. Small stones rolled away from the center of the light. I remember feeling a faint vibration through the ground beneath my boots. Then the object began to descend, slowly. It dropped maybe 15 feet closer to the gravel surface before stopping again. The humming sound deepened slightly. For a moment, it just hovered there. Then the light dimmed suddenly. The humming rose in pitch, and without warning, the object shot straight upward. The speed was unbelievable. 1 second it was hovering over the pit, the next it was already above the trees surrounding it. Within 2 seconds it had become a small, bright point high in the sky. Then it disappeared completely. The humming stopped instantly. My radio cleared up at the same moment. Dispatch came through asking if I had attempted to transmit earlier because they had received a burst of interference from my unit. I stood there looking up at the empty sky for several seconds before answering. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. By that time, the gravel pit looked completely normal again. We checked the area where the object had been hovering. The loose gravel had been pushed outward in a rough, circular pattern about 20 feet across. Other than that, there was nothing unusual. No debris, no burn marks. Later that morning, the report was filed as an unidentified aerial object observed hovering over the gravel pit before ascending rapidly out of sight. A few days later, we were informed that no aircraft had been operating in that area during the sighting. I've responded to a lot of strange calls during overnight patrol over the years. Most of them eventually turn out to have simple explanations. But that night at the gravel pit is one incident I've never been able to explain. Even now, when I drive past that same dirt road during late patrol, I sometimes slow down near the entrance and glance out over the pit. Most nights it's completely dark down there, but every once in a while I still catch myself looking up at the sky above it, wondering if that silent white light might appear there again. I was working the night shift in late winter when this happened. It was one of those cold, clear nights where the roads are empty and the sky looks huge once you get outside the town lights. Our department covered a wide stretch of highway that ran through farmland and a few scattered industrial areas. The call came in a little after 1:40 a.m. Dispatch said a maintenance worker at a water treatment plant had reported a large light hovering over the property. At first they thought it might be a helicopter because the plant sits near a reservoir and sometimes helicopters check infrastructure. But the caller said the object had been sitting there for several minutes and there was no sound at all. I was about 10 minutes away finishing up a traffic stop, so I told dispatch I'd head over. The treatment plant sits behind a long chain link fence with a gravel access road leading up to it. When I turned onto that road, I could already see a bright glow coming from somewhere inside the facility. It wasn't flashing like aircraft lights normally do. It was steady and almost too bright to look at directly. The maintenance worker was waiting near the gate when I pulled up. He looked nervous in the headlights. "You see it?" he asked right away. I stepped out of the cruiser and looked toward the center of the plant. There was a bright white light hovering above one of the large circular filtration tanks. The tanks themselves are maybe 30 feet across, and whatever was above it looked roughly the same size. From where we stood, it appeared like a round object with a ring of light around the bottom. "How long's it been there?" I asked. "About 15 minutes, he said. "I came outside to check a pump alarm and saw it just sitting there." I asked if it had moved at all. He said it drifted slightly once, but mostly stayed in the same spot. I unlocked the gate and drove slowly into the facility. The tanks, pipes, and metal walkways cast long shadows from the glow above. When I got closer, I shut off the cruiser and stepped out. The object was hovering maybe 40 feet above the tank. It was circular and smooth with no visible rotors or wings. The underside had a bright band of light that illuminated everything below it. The strangest part was the silence. Even at that distance, there was no engine noise, no rotor wash, nothing except a faint humming vibration in the air. I pulled out my radio to call it in. As soon as I keyed the mic, the radio filled with static. I tried again and got the same result. Behind me, the maintenance worker had stopped walking and was standing near the entrance watching. "What do you think it is?" he asked. I didn't answer because I honestly had no idea. While we were watching, the object shifted slightly to the right. It didn't tilt or bank like a helicopter would. It simply slid sideways through the air and stopped again. Then the light beneath it brightened. The metal railing around the tank reflected the glow so strongly it almost looked like daylight for a moment. At the same time, several of the plant's exterior lights flickered. One of the pumps near the building shut off with a loud click. The humming sound from the object deepened slightly, vibrating through the air. Then it began to descend, slowly. It dropped maybe 10 feet closer to the tank and hovered there. The water in the tank below it started to ripple in small waves, even though the surface had been completely still before. I remember feeling this strange pressure in my ears, like when you change altitude in an airplane. Then the light suddenly dimmed. For about a second, everything around us was darker than before. The humming noise rose in pitch, and then the object shot upward. The movement was incredibly fast. One moment it was hovering over the tank, the next it was already above the tallest structure in the facility. Within a couple seconds, it was just a small, bright point in the sky. Then it disappeared completely. The humming stopped immediately. The exterior lights at the plant returned to normal, and my radio cleared up at the same time. Dispatch came through asking if I had tried to transmit because they had received a burst of interference from my unit. I stood there looking up at the empty sky for a moment before answering. Backup arrived about 10 minutes later. We walked around the tank and the surrounding area looking for any kind of physical evidence. The only unusual thing we found was that the water in the tank was still moving slightly, even though the pumps had been off. There were no burn marks, no debris, and no damage to the equipment. The maintenance worker gave the same description I did when other officers asked what he saw. The report I wrote listed it as an unidentified aerial object hovering over the treatment plant before ascending rapidly out of sight. Later that week, the FAA confirmed there were no registered aircraft flying in that area at that time. I've responded to a lot of strange calls during my career, lights in the sky, people reporting things they couldn't explain. Most of the time, there's eventually a logical explanation. But that night at the treatment plant is the only one where I stood directly underneath something in the air and still couldn't figure out what it was. I only saw the notification the next morning. My security camera app sent me an alert around 2:14 a.m., but I'd been asleep and didn't check it until I was standing in my kitchen making coffee. I remember rubbing my eyes, half awake, and tapping the thumbnail expecting to see a raccoon or maybe a stray cat. My backyard isn't fenced well, and animals wander through all the time. But instead of the usual clip, there was just a 2-second video of pure white. Not bright like a flashlight, not blown out like a glitch. It was a single solid wash of white that filled the entire frame. Yard, porch, trees, everything gone. I checked the timeline bar under the clip, expecting it to be corrupted, but something else was wrong. The time jumped. The clip started at 2:14:06 a.m., it ended at 2:14:06 a.m., and the next video started at 2:13 a.m. 7 seconds missing. At first I figured maybe the camera hiccuped. It's a cheap model, and the Wi-Fi in my house cuts out sometimes. But when I stepped to the back door and looked outside, something felt off. The grass looked damp even though it hadn't rained. The air felt still and warm, like the oven had been on. And the birds, which normally scream their heads off at dawn, were quiet. I told myself I was overthinking it. I forced myself to drink coffee, feed the dog, and get ready for work. But I kept checking the camera feed on my phone, scrubbing back and forth between 2:14:06 and 2:13, like I had missed something. Nothing. Just the same blank flash and a dead gap. That night, around 10, I decided to sit up and watch the yard live. I wasn't expecting anything. Mostly, I wanted to prove to myself that nothing weird was happening. I turned on the porch light and left the curtains open just a couple inches so I could see the window from the couch. By midnight, I was bored. I muted the TV and listened for anything outside, but the only sound was the refrigerator humming. I checked the yard again. Nothing. Just still grass and the faint pool of porch light. Around 1:40, I nodded off. I don't remember falling asleep. I just remember jerking awake suddenly, like someone whispered something too close to my ear. The house was dark, except for the porch light seeping in through the window crack. My phone screen was lit up on the coffee table. Another motion alert. My heart started pounding because I hadn't heard anything. No footsteps on the deck, no rustling. I reached for the phone with that weird, shaky hesitation you get when you're not sure you want to see what's on the screen. The thumbnail was white again. I tapped it, Same thing as the night before, a burst of white filling the whole frame. But this time it lasted longer, 3 seconds instead of 2, and the timestamp jumped again, this time by 9 seconds. I checked the live feed. The yard looked normal, totally normal. Porch light on, fence in the back catching the glow, nothing moving, but the air in the house felt different, heavy like before a storm, except the forecast was clear. Even the dog, who normally sleeps through everything, was standing in the hallway staring toward the back door with her ears pinned flat. I turned off the TV and walked to the window. The moment I touched the curtain, the outside world felt wrong. Not visually. Everything looked the same,